Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Before we jump into the show, just wanted to let you know that our Super Cub is back. It's been, months since we've had a Super Cub for sale on our website. This is an awesome knife, and it's actually kind of a cool knife to have available this week with the guest that we've got coming on, being that John Barklow works so much on Alaska. So the Super Cub drops on Thursday night, 7 o'clock Mountain Standard Time. It's an awesome knife. So I hope you guys check that out. As I said, this week, we've got John Barklow as our guest on the podcast. John was a Navy diver, and he's actually just been a guy that's done a ton of different stuff, and he's just developed a wealth of knowledge that he's now sharing across the industry these days. So he works for Sitka Gear. He develops a lot of their hunting gear that you guys are wearing currently right now. Just a very knowledgeable person, very well respected, one of the most respected guys that I know in the industry. You say John Barklow's name to about anybody, and you can just see that there's a lot of respect in people's eyes. So I hope you guys enjoy the show. It was an honor talking with John, and I appreciate him coming on. All right, John Barklow, thanks for joining me and Henry here.
Finally.
Yeah, we've been talking about it.
I know. It seems like a year.
I know. I think when I first started this, I was trying to maybe get you on, and I was going to bring my stuff to your house. And
I think that's how it started.
Yeah, but it's things all work out for a reason. I think this is better. We've gotten to know each other better, and plus we're a little blurry-eyed and a little tired after a long weekend here, but it was a good time with our little party here.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the invite, but the energy. So I was telling Jules last night driving home, I'm like, just the positive energy when you're hanging around awesome people.
Yeah.
Like, and you just feed off that. Man, if people haven't experienced that, they need to.
Yeah.
And the group that you brought together the last couple days, it was just excellent. Like, you might not have ever met some of these people, and you're just like, whoa, man, like, that's some great energy. And so it was really cool.
The group of people that were here were just amazing humans. I mean, I'm constantly pinching myself that I get to hang around people like this, you know.
Well, you're kind of the common denominator. At least this weekend you were.
Well, I guess, but
you invited us.
I don't. Yeah,
nobody showed up. I don't think unannounced. So.
You know, and I think we probably all feel this way at times. But it's like you feel like you're the one person in the room that doesn't belong. You know, because there's so many accomplished people, so many people that do such cool stuff. Yeah, it's hard to feel like all the time like I deserve to be there.
The imposter syndrome is real.
Yeah.
I've talked about this. I forget with who. Might have been Jack or Andy at some point, but it's a very real thing. You just have to realize that everybody feels it at some point.
Yeah. It's really a room like this, you know, was really what propelled me to have the confidence to start MKC, because, you know, I took my prototype knives to Winter Strong out at Bert Soren's. And much the same, you know, at that event, there's Olympians and there's professional athletes, and then there's, you know, unbelievably successful businessmen and amazing, accomplished, you know, veterans that have done incredible things overseas, and, you know, incredibly accomplished hunters. And, you know, at an event like that, it's just a mix and a mashup of, like, just awesomeness everywhere. And, when you hang out around people like that for 3 straight days, you know, they say if you want to soar, hang out with eagles, don't hang out with the turkeys, right?
Mm-hmm.
And coming home from that weekend, that was the first time I had hung around a group of people that accomplished, and it was like that energy, that feel of like wind in your sails of like, man, we can do this. If people like this are going to like be behind us and support us, like, we can do it. But then you got to turn around and do the work. But, you know, when you hang out in your daily life, like a lot of the people I worked with are great people, you know, and a lot of the people I'm friends with around here, you see at basketball games for the kids or whatever, they're great folks. But that level of drive and accomplishment that those people at those kind of events have, like, it makes you go home and it's like you've got a breath of fresh air and you're just like ready to go.
That's a great way to describe it, that breath of fresh air. I think what would surprise people is when you're in those groups, you would maybe think, well, it's just a bunch of big egos and nobody's going to get along and everybody's going to be real arrogant. And it is absolutely the opposite of that. Like you could literally go up to, like you said, a business guy or the best professional shooter in the business or whatever, and they would go out of their way to help you if you had a question.
Yeah.
And just that sharing of ideas.
Yeah.
And that energy transfer. Yeah, that's I mean, the first, and I couldn't remember exactly when that was, but that first time I was around a group like that, that's what surprised me. Because you kind of go in a little guarded.
Yeah.
You're like, well, you know, I got to put my guard up, like jumping in the shark tank with a bunch of sharks.
Yeah.
And that's true.
It's going to be a dick measuring contest.
Exactly. And it's absolutely not that. And every time I've ever been around that, it's the same. It's just this, I don't know. I don't want to say brotherhood because there's women there too, but you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, and people sitting around asking me about MKC and talking about this and that and whatever, and then, you know, I've been at these deals where it's been kind of like focused towards me as far as like in this, like the beginning of a discussion, and then finally it's like, hey, what do you do? And it's like, oh, I'm world champion, whatever. And it's like, holy shit, why are we talking about me here? Like, I want to hear more about that. And, you know, even last night, one of the gals finally sitting around the campfire, this has been 3 days. She finally asks, like, it was like midnight. She asked Derek, she goes, so what do you do for a living? And he's like, oh, I was a professional football player in the NFL, you know, won a Super Bowl and was a Pro Bowler. And she's like,
and he's just sitting around the campfire like
she had
everybody
no idea.
else.
Yeah. Yeah, it's cool. So, and you know, it's got to be a similar feeling like in the SEAL teams, like when you have that feeling of a group of accomplished people like that. I was thinking about this when we were out at an event, and the guys from Seekins Precisions were doing a bunch of shooting training, and the Hat Creek training guys, and I was watching Matty Nelson teach, which you got to see him teach a little bit yesterday, shooting guns.
Incredible instructor. I mean, he's got the personality for it to back up the skill set.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you watch a guy like that run through, you know, a couple magazines shooting, you know, people targets with an AR, and it's like if you had 12 other dudes that are of the same level of ability as that guy and good equipment, you would feel absolutely indestructible. And I'm not a veteran. I haven't been there. I mean, you've been there, but like that feeling of team and that feeling of amazing people around you and like, oh, with these people, I can accomplish anything, you know, and that's how I've kind of felt with our company, like with these people supporting us and we can accomplish anything. But what is that like? Is that a sense of a feeling that you had when you were in, of just like when you have people around, like you feel like you can accomplish anything you guys go out and do?
So there's definitely that feeling in that community, which I was, you know, very thankful to be a part of. But I'll tell you, with that feeling and with that, we'll call it capability, there's a burden that goes along with that, which is most people don't feel that they're worthy to be there, and everybody works their ass off to be the best they can be so that they don't become the weak link. And so that energy, again, we're talking about, you know, so if that guy's the best shooter and this other guy's the best whatever, like they're feeding off each other because they both want to be the best. And maybe you won't be able to knock that guy off, which is fine, but that guy pulls everybody along to be better than they could be on their own. And so this, you know, I talk about this a lot in the mountains, like backcountry, you know, hunting partners, let's just say hunting partners. In the backcountry, it's just a little more, there's just more at odds, right, at stake, so to speak. But, you know, if 2 people or 3 people hunting together aren't greater than the sum of their parts, right, so I call it a force multiplier, then you need to go find different partners. Mm-hmm. But when you are that, it's like 12 people or 3 people, or whatever the group is, they actually play much bigger than they are because they can feed off each other. And that, again, you put that ego aside and you're like, well, this is what we need to do to, you know, get the job done, or you know, get back to camp, or whatever it is, you know.
I imagine, kind of like you were saying with the teams, probably that imposter syndrome was alive and well there as well. You know, you look around and you're like, God, that guy's way better at shooting than I am, or I feel like that guy's way better shape than I am, or a better swimmer. Like you say, I think that probably drives the other dude's thinking the same thing, like, oh, John's way better at this than I am. And probably drives you all to continue making sure you're not that weak link, I suppose.
Yeah, I think Andy talked about this a little bit, but at some point we've talked about this, but you sit there and you're like, I'm actually not that good at what I do, right? And it's not self-deprecating. It's like in my mind right now, I'm thinking of like guys that are tougher, guys that are stronger, guys that are faster, guys that are and when you're around now, other guys may think that about you. But I think if you have the right mindset, you're like, but other guys are better than me. And so it just keeps pushing you. To be completely honest, so I retired in 2014. And I just put my head down for 2 years. And I'm like, all I need to focus on is what I used to call building my civilian resume. Because I didn't have one, right?
Yeah.
I was in the military. Like, there's skills that transfer over, but a lot of them are intangible. It was after that 2 years when I got to pick my head up that I really started to struggle with being in the, quote, civilian world, because that team, that competition, that unrelenting, just like on your ass, like you better perform, I just realized it wasn't there, right? I had put myself in a crucible, my own crucible, to get where I wanted to get to start my next life. And then I looked around, I'm like, yeah, and I'm not going back. Like, this is it. Yeah. And but events like what we just had, you got Jim Miller, right?
Right.
I mean, how many UFC fights has he had? 40. He's won 40 some.
Yeah,
I think.
the most wins in the history of the UFC, and I think the most starts.
Right.
Yeah.
And you're just sitting there hanging out, having a drink with them, and you're like, yeah, man, this is the group I want to be around again. Or I haven't been to Winter Strong, but I keep hearing it over and over and over and over again that. That's the same type of environment. And these are environments that I think a lot of us thrive in.
You wouldn't be surprised to find out that after you and Jules left the other night, and after a little bit more alcohol was consumed, that it ended up with Jim Miller slapping us, Cole Kramer getting slapped on the face by Jim Miller, and Cole's wearing that like a badge of honor. They had MKC stickers, and they were putting 2 stickers down in the middle of the table, and you'd say go, and they each had to pick up their sticker and get that little adhesive back off of it. And the guy that got the back off first put it in his hand and slapped that sticker on the other guy's face.
Well, I won the bet with myself because I'm like, I don't know how we could get out of this weekend without something like that happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's
good to know.
It was pretty fun. Yeah. And occasionally Jim choking somebody. And it's all not because Jim wants to do any of that. It's all because all of us were egging him on the entire time.
Yeah.
Cole Kramer absolutely egging Jim on like crazy. Cole was really wanting to be slapped.
Well, I think you just said it. He wanted that badge of honor.
Yeah.
He's
going to
go. He probably won't wash that cheek.
He's going to go back to Kodiak and tell everybody he took a shot from the best UFC fighter of all time.
Yeah.
Or the winningest anyway. So with the to get to kind of what you're doing today with everything that you're doing with your training, I kind of want to go back a little bit about the foundation that you built and the skills that you kind of built in the military. So for the people that don't know, as we've kind of been talking here, you were a Navy SEAL, but what age did you actually go in?
Yeah, so I let's set the record straight. I wasn't a Navy SEAL. This is what a lot of people don't understand. I had one of the most unique careers that I know of, right?
Yeah.
So went into the Navy as a diver.
Okay.
Navy diver.
Yeah.
Right? We could walk through all that, but did that for 6 years. At the end of that 6 years, I was going to get out of the Navy because I was overseas, and I did everything I'd wanted to do dive-wise. I had, months and months and months of time accumulated underwater, and I got bored with it. I got the opportunity to go and teach SEALs how to get in and out of submarines underwater. So this was this was a thing back in the day. It's much more refined now, like what Trevor and those guys did. So I went over there. I started doing that, And I was like, oh, this is the community I want to be in.
Okay.
Like all of a sudden, like
These are my kind of people.
if you had something to offer, they took it. Right. So here I am, and I'm like, next thing I know, I'm like going down to Puerto Rico on submarine trips, and I'm like helping platoons get in and out of water, you know, like James Bond stuff. It was really cool. I realized I didn't want to leave that. So I ended up going to a SEAL team on the West Coast, SEAL Team 5, and running what they called their combat swimmer department. So this is where you start doing more the tactical diving aspect of it. And it was because I'd built a reputation on the East Coast that they said, well, yeah, maybe you should be the guy that does this. So I went and did that. This is where I met Andy. This is where I met, I had to get his name right. This is where I met Jack.
Yeah.
His new guys checking in, right? So did that for 5-6 years. But in the meantime, talking about if you have a skill to offer, that they will take it. I started teaching because I didn't know if I was going to stay in. I started kind of running to become a mountain guide, ski mountaineering guide, climbing guide, like seemed like a reasonable thing to do at the time. I was pursuing my professional calls on my off time.
Yeah.
Heading up to the Sierras. Having no idea that 9/11 was looming on the horizon. So did that, actually went to Kodiak, helped run a platoon through their winter warfare training up there at the time.
Well, let's step back before we get into that.
Yeah.
Because when you say there's
Yeah,
stories,
and please, because I'm glossing over a lot of stuff.
well, yeah, because I want to dig in a little bit to the, you know, when you were in high school, did you know you wanted to go into the Navy? Did you know you wanted to dive? Did you love water? What was that?
So we could probably back that up to kindergarten.
Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to be in the military.
Where'd you
I wanted
grow
to
up?
serve Cleveland, Ohio.
Okay, so lots of diving opportunities in the ocean there.
Yeah. You always want what you don't have.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, like the diving, the frogman thing, like all that really appealed to me. I really can't tell you why. My dad was a marine biologist in Florida for, you know, a few years prior to me even being around. I'm the oldest. So, you know, there was like dive masts and fins and stuff laying around. And so I don't know why, but aside from the serving my country, and I think my parents instilled that in me, all I really wanted was a life of adventure.
Yeah.
And I knew I wasn't going to get it in Cleveland, Ohio.
Yeah.
So it was torturous in some regard. Like without sports, I would have been somewhat miserable. And I just couldn't wait to get out of Cleveland, get out of Ohio, get out of the Midwest, and just go and find adventure.
Yeah.
Somewhere. And I felt that the military, you know, and you go back and forth as a kid. You're like, do I go into the Forest Service? Do I go do this? Do I go do that? And it's like, I just kept coming back to, no, it's got to be the military. And there's a time limit. You know, you can only join the military at certain ages. So it's not like you can go, you know, be an accountant for 20 years and then decide to be in the military. You got to go to the military first. You can be an accountant later. So there was always that drive, you know, and I got my scuba qual and all that stuff in high school. And
in high school.
Yeah. And so, you know, diving in really cold, murky quarries. And
yeah.
So I was just like, I just couldn't, honestly, I could not wait to get out of school just so I could get on with my life.
Your parents were obviously supportive of you pursuing the diving and all that.
I mean, they were, you know, like I said, I'm the oldest, so they had to live through it the first time with me. I did, at their request, try to get into the Naval Academy. I think you do that when you're a junior in high school.
Yep.
There was really no chance in hell that was ever going to happen. But, you know, at least I tried. I satiated their intent. I was going to go to, you know, I went to school for a little bit, like college for like this far, to play football. And maybe I was going to get into ROTC. I realized I didn't want to play football and I didn't want to go to college. I wanted to get on with my life.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I by the time I decided, I went to see the recruiter 2 weeks later. I was on a plane to boot camp.
Really?
Yeah.
So why the Navy was just because of diving? Is that it?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I went back and forth. You know, the Army had the Green Berets, and the Marine Corps did some diving, but ultimately, yeah, you know, you flip a coin at the end of the day. I knew I was risking a lot because there was only really 1-2 things I ever wanted to do in the Navy. Of course, there's no guarantee. You get an opportunity, but there's no guarantee you'd ever make it through. And so if you don't, then, you know, the alternative was really going to suck.
Right. So were you pretty aware of the Navy SEALs at that point, going into the Navy? Or, because, I mean, a lot of times you hear these guys that are SEALs, and they were like, I had no idea what a SEAL was, like, got into the Navy, and then their path led that way. Or did you head in wanting to be a SEAL, or were you going in just wanting to head right towards the dive portion of it?
I didn't really, so, you know, there was no internet back then. I mean, this is like 1988.
I always tell people I was making knives and like running a knife business before the internet, which makes us sound ancient when you say
it does, but you're
older than the internet.
It's a God's honest truth.
Yeah.
So, you know, there were some books and stuff, but so I really didn't know the differentiation truly. Like I just thought it was all one big group, and in some regard it kind of is, but I wanted to do the diving thing. I thought, like, you know, UDT was a thing then, so underwater demolition teams, and then the SEAL teams, you know, and then the EODs thrown in there. So it was this whole big conglomerate. I'm like, I just want to go in that direction. Like, well, I'll figure it out. And I'm not really that guy, but there was only so much you could do to do things. We'll circle back on this, I'm sure, later on, but there was also, and I can picture it in my mind, but this military, like, survival book I'd gotten. And there's a picture of a guy, looks like he had just come onto the beach, you know, swam across the beach, and he was in a little black watch cap. He had a fire, and he was squatting down, he was cooking a fish, and I'm like, I want to be that guy. And what I meant by that was, like, a truly competent outdoorsman who could just go out and, like, live off the land.
Yeah.
Right? So there was, like, always this red thread of that kind of thing running through my blood. Yeah. Like, I like to say that my life is on a trajectory. It's kind of like that cannonball you shot, right? You don't exactly know where it's going to land, but you know the trajectory that you're on and that it's going to take. And as long as you make decisions to stay on that trajectory and are true to yourself, like, that's about all you can ask.
Yeah.
And so that's what I've done. And it's like, I just got to take this leap of faith. I got to walk through this door because it's open right now. I know that's the direction, don't exactly know the destination.
Yeah.
And so it's just been that constant kind of evolution, right?
Yeah.
And it's, you know, you can't look back on your life and go, well, like, if somebody said, well, would you do something different? Yeah, of course you'd always say that. But how fair is that if you are where you want to be right now? You're like, well, everything you've decided at least has gotten you to where you want to be. So
yeah, if changing something meant you might not get back to right here, then it's like, well, then no, I probably wouldn't change anything. But if I could change some things and make getting to right here a little bit easier,
right,
you know,
right,
or maybe you have it, you know, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And this will all tie together in a little bit here when we start bringing this all together, because you always have these forks in the road.
Yep.
And, you know, one fork would have led me one way, and who knows where I'd be right now.
Right.
You know?
So you you head off to boot camp, and what's that path then of how you ended up in the diving program?
So everybody had this, well, at the time, it was called the Dive Fair program. So that's what I had, because I said diver. My contract said diver. So all that meant was you had an opportunity to try. And if you made it, then the Navy got 2 more years out of you.
Yeah.
Instead of a 4-year enlistment, it was a 6.
Okay.
So, and I have very little memory, actually, of boot camp. I don't know if it's just, I hated it. Like,
did you?
Yeah, you want to talk about not being around a high-level functioning group of people, like, that was it, right? It just didn't sit with me. But there were people within there, and everybody wanted to go in they called it, like, what'd they call it? Like a special community or special program, I guess, right? And so there were a bunch of us in there. And so, like, at night, when the lights went out, we'd be, like, doing PT, or, you know, we'd be doing push-ups and sit-ups and stuff, like, between the bunk beds and stuff like that. Anyways, you get the opportunity to try out, you pass, and then At the time, you still had to go to a Navy school and get a Navy job, just in case before you went to your special school, you didn't make it. The Navy had invested some training in you. So, funny story, I had almost failed photography class in high school as a senior.
Yeah.
Because I was a jackass and just wasn't putting the effort in. And like I told you, I just want to get on with my life. And the assignment or something was to like go out and take a picture in nature. So had a camera, and I, didn't get the assignment done. And so I'm like, oh my God, I got to get this done, And so that morning, I remember I pulled like an Outdoor Life or something, one of those magazines, and I'd taken the camera on a tripod, turned it right down on this picture, and taken a picture of this beautiful white-tailed deer, and I'd made sure I'd cropped it and everything. And this was film. This wasn't digital.
Yeah.
And then that day, it's like I go in, I develop the film, I show him this picture. It's a badass picture. Like, I get an A. And then like the next day or two, he calls me, this guy, and good on him for not completely failing me, and he says, hey man, I got to give you a D on this. And he goes, I should fail you. And I'm like, wow, for what? And he goes, well, I can see the page number at the bottom of this picture. So he gave me a D for effort. So anyways, long story short, I just wanted to go through the quickest, shortest, we'll call it funnest or most entertaining school I could go through to get on to dive school. And so that was photography school.
Oh, really?
Interestingly enough, because I was focused now, I was, not that this is saying a lot, but I graduated top of my class.
Really?
So I went from almost failing high school because of photography school to being top of my class. And that just shows you what focus will do. I was just focused.
And again, way later on down the road in life, I'm sure you went a long time there, probably in the middle of your career when you're doing all this training. You weren't taking probably a lot of photos, but like you start heading into what you're doing now.
Yeah.
And guess what pops up, 20 years later, that you kind of need some of those skills, which is kind of wild.
Yeah, I can talk to photographers, and I generally know exactly what they're talking about.
Yeah.
F-stops and all that.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I get it. Depth of field. Yep, got it. Yeah.
So you went into your dive school. How was it hard? Were you pretty good at it? I mean,
I was very comfortable in the water, always have been.
Because I got to imagine most kids that were going into that dive school, because let's face it, you're still a kid at that point.
Yeah, I was 19.
Probably aren't dive certified like you were. I mean, I got to think there's a lot of dudes that were just like, yeah, I want to be a diver, and barely have swam anywhere.
Well, there were some guys that, truly had never seen the ocean, or at least I'd seen the ocean and been in the ocean. Some guys didn't know how to swim very well at all. Interestingly enough, like it was like the academics were challenging, and I didn't excel at academics in high school, but dive physics and the chemistry of it and all that, like I understood it, and I did very well on that side of it. Where I didn't particularly like it was these group PT sessions. So you're in a class, and that class does everything together. They go to chow, they work out, they do uniform inspections, all this stuff, that you would normally associate with the military. I didn't particularly like that. What I realized is I liked the military. I wanted the discipline, but I was always trying to seek a smaller group of people to be around with.
Yeah.
I didn't like, you'd hear this often, well, because you're only as strong as your weakest link, right? So it's like one person screws up, everybody suffers. One person screws up, everybody suffers. So, me and my buddy, we finish the swim first, but somebody doesn't, and then we all suffer. But with all that said, dude, I was living my dream.
Yeah.
I was doing what I wanted to do.
Right.
Like, I remember my very first open water swim in Panama City, Florida. Had a pair of the standard little UDT shorts. Mm-hmm. Pair of fins. I think, I don't know if we had a wetsuit top on or not. And we're walking out to the bay, and it's a snowstorm in northern Florida.
No shit.
And I'm thinking, I don't know if I really want to do this or not.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that was like somehow foreshadowing, but the rest of my career was being around really cold water in the winter.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But no, I had a great time going through that.
I will say, and I think when you were in high school, I was much the same way. And I think a lot of, especially boys, are this way. I mean, let's face it, if you look back thousands of years, like, I don't think little boys were cut out to sit still in a building for 12 years. You know, the most active time of your life when you're 7, 8, 10, 12 years old, 15 years old, to have to sit still and listen to something. And you know, I was always a kid that I really did not do well in school when I was a little kid, like first, second grade, because like all I wanted to be outside was just playing with my backhoes.
Yep.
You know, or building tree forts. And then I remember in high school too, same thing. Like I thought I had life figured out. Like I was going to take over my parents' excavation business. And to me, I was wasting time. I was sitting in school because like all summer I worked for my dad, you know, digging basements and building roads, and I'm running heavy equipment, and like I'm good at it, like really good at it, and making good money too. My folks paid me well because like we were getting a lot of work done. And then September hits and you have to go back to school, and I'm just like, my dad's still going hard for like 2.5 more months till winter flies. And I remember just being frustrated, like I could just be out making money and getting better and building the business and doing all that. And I think so often, you know, that's the struggle with school for young boys is they do a shitty job in the class. Like I got basically C's. Like I got just good enough grades to keep my parents kind of off my ass, but sometimes not even that good, and they were on my ass, but could have easily done better. And I think down the road, you take that same kid that all of a sudden he is in college or he is in a job like an apprenticeship, and he's doing book work for that apprenticeship and crushes it because he's actually interested in it.
Exactly.
Like you see purpose, you know. And my dad would even say, like, I don't understand why your math teachers won't take your class out to our gravel pit and calculate how many cubic yards is in a pile of gravel, you know, or, hey, we have this big basement we have to build, right? We have to dig, but how many dump truck loads are going to come out of this, you know? Well, then that figures into how much we have to charge the customer for a bid. And like, if I would have been taught math that way in high school, to a little bit more related to life, you know, like Pythagorean's theorem. I could give a shit about Pythagorean and his theory or theorem or whatever. And all of a sudden I'm a lineman and I need to know the length of a guy wire. Well, A squared plus B squared equals C squared. C squared happens to be the length of our guy wire we need. And I can literally do that math just by pacing off steps.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, gosh, I wish they'd have just told me that I would have used it in like this way in real life instead of just telling me about Pythagorean, you know. That whole relation of what you're doing for your schoolwork, I think, you know, guys like you and me and a bunch of us, like all of a sudden it means something and you're paying attention and you excel. Like photography class, you know.
Yeah.
All of a sudden it means more. You pay attention, you crush it.
Yeah. No, it's focus. You know,
Yeah.
It's like I think, you know, college kind of becomes a default, and I'm not so sure that's the best default anymore, you know, and a lot, you hear this over and over and over again, people who struggled in school at whatever level, and then once they get out and they finally find what they're supposed to be doing, they absolutely excel. And so, you know, in one venue, you're called maybe dumb or looked upon that way. And then in another venue, you could almost be a genius.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's like, don't paint with so broad a brush all the time.
It's purpose.
It's
finding
purpose.
Like once a man or a woman kind of finds purpose, I think that's where a lot of these kids are kind of lost. They don't have any purpose. They don't have any passion for whatever. And once you find that, it's like a light switch goes off.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not, generally speaking, I'm not good at math.
Yeah.
But going through those schools where you have to learn, you know, these gas laws and you have to write all these things out, and, you know, they're they're probably somewhat calculated now. And when you started getting into mixed gas diving in some of my later schools, it got very, very complex, right? And you have people's lives at stake here.
Yeah,
you
not just yours, but your buddy.
Exactly. And you have to figure all these things out and figure out percentages of this and that. I can do that stuff like the back of my hand, right? Because there's purpose to it.
Yes.
Or like, you know, what you were saying, the pile of gravel. It's like, oh, that all of a sudden gives me focus to figure this out, because that answer is really important.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Was dive school incredibly, like, physically demanding? Because I know when I swim, and I suck at swimming, so I make it harder than swimming should be. It's physically demanding.
Yeah.
You know, swimming's tough.
I've thought about it a lot. I mean, at the time, not so much. But it changes. You know, like, you hear, I'm going to sound old, but, you know, well, when I went through, we did this or that, right? You know, when I went through that first course, I think that pool phase where they see if you're comfortable in the water and they beat the hell out of you underwater and everything, like, that was 3 full days. Mm-hmm. And people are like, oh, bullshit. And I'm like, no, back in 1988 or 9, whatever, like, that's what they did. Like, that's just what they did. And then, you know, but I loved it. I literally loved it. Was I glad it was over? Yeah. But, you know, it was, and it's hard for me to remember. I think it was like a 3-month school. Don't quote me on that.
Yeah.
And then the follow-on school a couple years later was maybe another 3 months, you know, so maybe 6 total months, but kind of broken up that way. But it didn't matter what they did to me. I just wanted to be there.
Yeah.
You know, there was just no other choice.
So,
really.
So when you got, you know, you accomplished getting through dive school and you become a diver.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So what kind of jobs then are you doing?
Yeah. So this is where the conversation goes south. So hold me.
Okay.
Don't let me go too far astray.
Okay.
So you fill out this form and you're like, where do you want to go? They let you believe that you have a choice, which in some regard you don't. And they're like, you know, do you want to go to the East Coast? Do you want to go to the West Coast? Do you want to go to this type of command or that type of command, blah, blah, blah. And I said, I want to go to San Diego.
Right.
And I don't really care what I do. I just want to go to San Diego,
All
right? I wanted to get the hell off the East Coast.
Isn't that the answer I would think that everyone would give?
No, you'd be amazed. A lot of people want to go to, like, Virginia Beach, you know, or stay in Florida. They could have stayed in Florida somewhere. I said, I want to go to San Diego. And I ended up in the Philippines. So remember I told you I was always seeking, I've always been continually seeking, like, these smaller groups, these more focused groups. Anything where you can, like, really start to polish and refine your skills and work with people that have this great energy, how we started this conversation. I'm like, I didn't even know where the hell the Philippines was, okay?
Right.
My parents are, like, kind of freaked out. They're like, what do you mean you're going to the Philippines, you know?
Yeah.
I was like, yeah. And so anyways, I get a plane ticket. I get a bus ticket and a plane ticket. And they're like, take this bus to this airport and then get on this plane, and 24 hours later I'm in Manila, right? Well, that really set, that command set the course for the rest of my military career. And I realized I was exactly where I wanted to be. So I checked into a very small dive locker, they called it. And I think at the time, there might have been 6 or 7 or 8 people. And it was myself, absolutely the most junior guy. Mm-hmm. And everybody else was senior, to include people that were towards the end of their career. Now, understand, this was 89. A lot of these guys had been in 20-some, almost 30 years. Every one of them was a Vietnam vet.
Yeah.
And these guys had been in the Mekong Delta, blowing up obstacles, getting in gunfights on boats and stuff like this. And I show up, and they're like, hey, Junior, like, welcome.
You still have milk on your chin.
Yeah, but the experiences that I got to have, because they didn't want to get, you know, they would, and they did, but they didn't want to get in the water anymore. So then another guy shows up a couple weeks after me, just like me, brand new. And, dude, for the next 2 years, we dove on average 6 days a week 6 to 8 hours a day. So a lot of it was shallow water. We would do everything from, so the Philippines was considered like a forward operating base for like ships and stuff. So we would do everything from diving on a ship because they had hit a whale and they needed to see what the damage was. I forget the name of the ship, but one ship had hit a mine in the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, and it'd come in. There'd been some people killed. We had to dive on that. Any submarine that came in had to be a security swim, it was called. So you had to swim the whole submarine underwater, checking for mines and stuff like this before and after. Body recoveries, picking up airplanes, you name it, we did it. And almost every dive, it was me and this other guy. And then slowly that locker got built out. Maybe there was a dozen people. Got sent to the Persian Gulf for the first Gulf War, deployed down to was it Mindanao and some down in the southern Philippines when they had some, they still do have some Civil War stuff going on. And
With
just,
like
it was very eclectic, but we were just 12 dudes that had bags, and it's like, we'll travel anywhere in the Pacific. And we did. And we did some really, really fun stuff. And all our diving, even though I'd been trained to do like the formal hard hat stuff, every bit of our diving was scuba. So just this completely self-contained, on your own, you and a buddy, like figuring it out kind of stuff. And I like, it's probably some of the best time of my life.
Yeah. Were you taking down like Navy welders too? Diving, like, would you take down and help like fix stuff or?
No. So we didn't do any of that. If that, because it was so far out in the Pacific, if anything like that had to be done, they had to go to like Hawaii or somewhere like that.
Okay.
But I will tell you a quick story. So part of that first dive school, they at least want to give you an introduction to welding, but it really wasn't a thing at the time, like at all. But, you know, you go down, it's like this tank you're in, so you're not, like, actually in the ocean or the bay, you know. And they give you, like, whatever, 3 or 4 rods, and you have to just weld 2 pieces of steel together. You know, I watched you the other day. Every time I see somebody weld, I joke. I just laugh at myself. But so anyways, I run through those 4 rods, right? And you can imagine, like, it's cloudy as shit, and you can't see anything. You're trying to do it by feel, but I don't know what I'm doing. And so I get done with 4 rods. And those 2 pieces of steel aren't even remotely like close to being joined, right?
Yeah.
So they like send me down 2 more. And, you know, when you're doing it I don't know if you ever done it underwater, but when you do it underwater, you have to tell the people on the surface, like, okay, turn the electricity on, basically, right? And when you feel that, they tell you, like, okay, when you say, and I forget what the term was, but basically power on, but it was something different. They say, don't make sure your teeth aren't together. Separate your teeth, because you can feel that current running through your body.
Yeah.
And if you get, you know, the wrong jolt of current or whatever, it'll melt your fillings and weld your teeth together.
Holy shit. So
I'm like, fuck, I don't want to, like, I didn't sign up for this, you know? Anyways, at the end of 6 rods, this guy comes over the PA, and he's like, I think I was an airman. That was my rank at the time. He goes, Airman Barklow? He says, the United States Navy does not have the time nor the patience to teach you how to weld. You are now done. And I was like, thank God. Good. Like, I am out of here. Later on, that became a thing. When I was in Virginia Beach, that became a thing. And guys who went and got trained at that and were really good. Imagine underwater, upside down, you know, in the dark, the whole thing. Like,
oh, man.
And those guys learned skills that they took on to make very good careers out of.
For sure. And that's when you need to weld something underwater, that's very likely something's going on. That's a problem.
Very much so. Kind of an immediate problem.
Yeah. I've seen just some of the videos of that online and whatnot, and it's like, that dude's invaluable. That guy that's under there welding, because it's not, you know, not very many people that can do that.
No, it's an absolute skill, and I don't have that skill. I'm very good at other things, like touch-wise, but like that wasn't one of them.
So when you were, say, the first Gulf War, you know, that was what were you doing as a Navy diver over there?
Yeah, so we were deployed. There was, again, small group. There were 6 of us deployed. I remember we flew into Oman. Spent some time in Oman. The quote war hadn't kicked off yet, and then there was a U.S. merchant ship So it wasn't a Navy ship, but it was a merchant ship, big oil tanker. And it had run into like an uncharted reef or pinnacle, and split its bow and started spilling fuel. And no kidding, it was getting harassed, so it had to go somewhere. I can't remember exactly where we ended up going, but anyways, it had to go somewhere, and so but they couldn't bring it into port until they figured out like what the damage was. Could it be repaired? Like, is this an environmental disaster? So we flew out, series of helicopter rides via different Navy ships and stuff, and eventually got onto this ship, and then had to dive the ship and figure out like what the damage was. Could it be isolated? Because there's, I guess, different ways to isolate those tanks. And so we had to figure all that out. They got the thing from leaking too much oil. And then because they're kind of out there, this ship, I don't even remember the name of it. It was kind of like wounded, so to speak, that I remember several times getting harassed by the Iranian gunboats as we were going through the Straits of Hormuz.
Really?
As the war started to kick off. Yeah. So we were like on the, manning the rails with these merchant guys. I think I had an M14, like just a classic old M14.
Yeah.
Right? Just like nobody had to shoot each other. I mean, it would have been cool if we did, and I'm just like, wow, like this is just a cool, diverse, like I never thought this happened. Yeah, so many stories, I think we ended up like drunk and hung over in Dubai trying to like hitch a plane back to the Philippines at some point. And like, yeah, it was a good time. It was a good time. That's when I really got my first taste of being a part of something bigger than you.
Yeah.
Like this giant machine that you were just one tiny, tiny little cog in the wheel, but the whole machine was like doing something cool.
Yeah. That's amazing. I'm sure you probably can't say where or when or whatever, but were you talk about underwater mines, were you ever a part of setting any of that stuff? Is that something that we ever did, or?
Not to my knowledge. So there were guys that EOD guys got trained to do that. So the second dive school I ended up going to after the Philippines, and again, you talk about a door, right? A moment in time, and it's like, what do you do? And it's like, I probably could have gone to SEAL training if I wanted to, but I'm like, but I had such an amazing command I was leaving. I'm like, well, I'm going to keep doing this. That second school is where they, at the time, I don't think they do it anymore, but that's when they started teaching us underwater demolition.
Okay.
It was underwater demolition, not so much for destruction, like just pure destruction, but destruction for, clearing a reef to get boats through. Or, we did several jobs when I was when I ended up in Little Creek, there in Virginia Beach, where we blew things down to tamp them down into the seabed to like open up lanes of commerce, right? So that ships wouldn't run into it, or small boats. So we did that. So we learned demo there. Anyways,
with the diving, so we've been hotly debating this back and forth this last couple weeks, because on Friday I'm taking my kids to Hawaii.
Oh,
and Jess we have a connection of a guy that wants to maybe take us spearfishing.
Yeah,
and Hank and I are equally not a fan of being eaten by sharks. And Hank's like, I'm not getting in the water. I'm not getting. And I'm like, I'm kind of just as somewhat fearful of, just because I never grew up around water, never really grew up around the ocean.
Yeah.
Been in a few times, but that ocean's deep and there's a lot of shit in there that can eat you.
Yeah. But it's really clear, so you can see it at least coming.
Yeah, which I'm not sure. I think I'd rather just be.
I don't know if that's a benefit or not.
Rather just be chomped and not even know it was coming. Are you talk about like? Were there times you were down doing stuff and all of a sudden something goes bump in the night? I mean, because you had to have seen some wild stuff under the surface of that water at times, and probably sometimes I would imagine you'd be like, what the hell is that? And what are we doing down here with it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you definitely – I think if anybody does it long enough, you have run-in with sharks. So a lot of the diving – I mean, I definitely have dove at night. It's kind of one of those things you have to put out of your mind because it's a little interesting. But you definitely have run-ins with sharks and different sea creatures. Sometimes you know what they are. Sometimes you don't. When I was 13 years old, I snuck in with my buddy to go see the movie Jaws.
Yeah.
And it absolutely terrified me to the point that I don't think I went swimming in the municipal pool the rest of that summer. I mean, you just realize you're not.
It terrorized an entire nation.
Yeah. Well, you realize you're not at the top of the food chain.
And I saw it on TV the other day, and it is so terrible. The graphics and the what do you call it when they do like the green screen stuff and everything they do now, the CGI type stuff on movies. Like I'm watching Jaws the other day, and I was like, this is just horrible. Like they just did how did this?
Now when you're 13.
How did this scare?
Now when you're 13.
Oh my God, Jaws was like terrifying.
But so I'll tell you I'll just tell you two of the quick stories just to kind of give you that idea. So now here I am. We're down in the Bahamas somewhere. I've gone through my second dive school. I'm on the East Coast now, and I've got some more responsibilities, but we needed to go 8-10 miles offshore from one of the islands down there, maybe Eleuthera or one of those, out to this experimental ship. And the job was, there was all these little X's or crosses painted on the bottom of the ship. They were about as big around as this coffee cup lid. And I don't know what they were doing, and they didn't tell us, and I didn't ask. And all we had to do was every day go out there and move these sensors from one part of the ship to another and make sure that they were placed on these little X's, right? And then they'd go do whatever test overnight. And it was just like this acoustical area. It was like perfectly acoustically sound to do this test or whatever. It was like 8,000 feet of water, if I remember, right? Crystal clear. So we do this for a couple days. And then we go out there one day, and dude, this whole ship, which was a giant, if you can imagine, a giant catamaran.
Okay.
This whole ship, there's sharks all around this ship, like all around it. Surface, fins going through the water. It's clear, so you can see sharks, and we're like, we're not diving. Like, we'll come back tomorrow. Something happened, or go back out there the next day. There's even more sharks.
The
like,
hell?
What? Yeah, we're like, what the hell? And so come to find out, when we left, every morning when we go out there and there's sharks, we'd leave. Well, the reason there were sharks is because as soon as we left, they were chumming and fishing.
Who was?
The guys on the ship. And then we'd go back out there, and there were more sharks.
Yeah.
So finally, we're like, okay, F you guys. Like, no more fishing. We'll be out in 24 hours.
Here's my gear. You guys get to go do my
So
job.
we go back out there. There's not as many sharks. So we transfer from the boat, this bigger boat we took out there, to now this little rubber Zodiac. And me and this other guy are going to jump in the water. And a third guy's going to jump in with us with this little baseball bat to keep the sharks away. So you have to focus on what you're doing. This guy's going to focus on watching our back and keeping the sharks away. This was the plan we had. Seemed completely reasonable at the time. So I remember I'm in the Zodiac. I got my tanks on, two tanks on my back. I'm sitting down on the floorboard of the boat, and my fins are like, on the other side of the boat, and I'm looking out to sea. I kid you not, man. Like, people were there, so I'm not making this up. And we're getting ready to dive, going through our pre-dive checks. And no shit, my eyes are like this because the dive supervisor's sitting looking at me, so he can't see this. Me and the guy getting in the water are looking out to sea. We see this big shark fin, dorsal fin, on the surface, just like in the movie, comes streaming right by the boat and is like 2 feet behind the dive supervisor sitting on the Zodiac.
Holy shit.
He doesn't see it.
That's a Jaws.
We do.
Complete Jaws scene.
And my eyes must have been as big as saucers. And he turns around and sees it, and he's like, we're not diving. And me and the other guy, Gene, we're like, no, let's just do it. Let's just get it done. Like, what are the odds, right? You kind of like, you feed off each other. You kind of, get your balls, and you're like, yeah, plus we got this guy with the little baseball bat. Like, what could go wrong?
Barry Bonds.
So they're like, you don't have to do this. And we're like, no, we'll do it. So anyways, we get in the water, crystal clear. big current, so you got to kick like hell to just stay in place. So we go into the boat, and we're just like moving these sensors, and you're just like working your ass off. And you know you're breathing your air down super quick. But you're probably not going to be down there for more than 20 minutes. So you're like, you probably got enough air. Well, you know, you like my mind all of a sudden, I'm down there working with this guy, and all of a sudden I'm like, something doesn't seem right.
Spidey senses.
And I turn around, and because it's so clear, say we're like 30 feet down, something like that, I can look up, and the guy with the baseball bat, who is an older guy, probably my age now, right?
Yeah.
With the baseball bat, he couldn't keep up with the current and kicking, and he had breathed his tanks down too much. I can see him climbing back in the Zodiac. And so now me and Gene have no backup.
Yeah.
So we get done. Gene's like, because we're on scuba, so everybody's on their own. So Gene's like, I'm going up. I'm like, okay, I'm going to go up with you. And I get this spidey sense again, and I look down, and coming up out of the depths is this, I don't know, I think it was a white tip. Coming right at me, right at us, but right at me specifically, because I was lower than him. And the funny thing is, I thought I would have been scared. And I literally thought like I was watching a National Geographic television show. And in slow motion, in my mind, what I remember telling myself is, all you got to do is punch it in the nose.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay. And it came right at me, and it got right up, and I punched it in the nose. And it took off and swam down like that and disappeared into the depth. And as soon as it disappeared, that's when I got scared.
Yeah.
And I started swimming to the surface, remembering all my gas laws, blowing out my air. And I made it probably too fast because Gene was already in the boat, up to the rubber boat. And normally with all that gear on, you need at least one guy, if not two, to haul you in. Dude, I swam up to that boat, and in one fell swoop, I had like grabbed the sponson out of the water, pulled myself, and was right back in the boat. And they're like, how the hell did you do that? And I'm like, look down there.
Yeah.
That's wow, you know?
Did your buddy see that shark? Did he see it
He
happen,
never
or
saw
was
it.
he swimming?
No, he never saw it. So as we started to go up, like, okay, you know, we're going to go up. He started up. I was just a little behind him, and I just looked, and there he was. Well, he was already continuing up.
Do you think he was, had you not paid attention, do you think he had
I don't think he'd
intentions?
have bit me. I think he'd have hit me.
Yeah.
That seems to be what they do, is they'll bump you and just see if you're like an easy kind of thing. But apparently in that area, they're pretty common, but they're also pretty aggressive. So that was one. The other one, real quick, was we were off of San Clemente Island, where it's a Navy island, basically. And the SEAL teams have a huge training facility out there. So I was out there doing some training. I don't even know what. And the guy says, hey, man, you want to go? It was lobster season. He goes, hey, you want to go look for some lobsters at night? Assuming that's legal, but statute of limitations is up. So I'm like, yeah. So we just put on black wetsuits, because that's, you know, black fins, black dive masks, and we have a flashlight, and we're going to go out. And at dusk, again, what are you thinking? Like, it seemed reasonable at the time. At dusk, like when everything's coming out to feed, we're going to go swim in this alcove looking for lobster. Well, we knew it, but like a half mile offshore is this kind of like seal rookery where all these sea lions are.
Oh.
Which is like perfect for great whites.
Yeah.
And obviously great whites are out in that whole area. So you just get used to doing things after a while. So we're out there and we're swimming up, you know, maybe 10 yards off these rocks. And the guy's in front of me. I'm right behind him like this. And we have these flashlights and we're looking for lobster. So they're pointed down. And all of a sudden you see this thing come underneath you. And it was like, I don't want to overstate it, but 8-10 foot great white is like literally swimming right under us in the same direction we're going. With like his dorsal, we could have reached out and grabbed his dorsal.
Holy shit.
Like 2 feet away underneath us. And we didn't have to talk because, you know, then it just keeps going because it can swim faster than us and disappears into the darkness.
Oh, no.
Right where we're swimming. Again, that's when you get scared.
Yeah.
And no lobster was worth staying out there after that.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
I would imagine diving and doing that stuff, especially in the darkness, it's a little bit like walking in the woods with a headlamp. I mean, it's just black as can be. Like your headlamp.
Yeah, in grizzly country or something
right,
like that.
In the Bob Marshall.
Yes, it's very much the same.
You know there's bears. You know there's bears, and you're kind of just having faith that they're going to most likely see or smell you before you ever know that they're there.
Yeah.
And you're just kind of having faith they're going to just move along. Because I know we've all been hunting, you know, even in black bear country. Like, there's black bear shit that's so fresh that you know.
Yeah.
These bears know we're here. They see us. I haven't seen one. But you're walking with that headlamp back to the truck or hiking in or doing whatever you're doing. And your little tiny headlamp's going, 30 feet, 20 feet. And if you happen to actually see an animal, a threat, in your headlamp, it's close quarter shit.
Yeah.
And I would imagine being in the ocean's got to be real similar.
Yep. And it doesn't have to be in the dark, because oftentimes a lot of the water I dove in was just like completely shit water. Like you couldn't, sometimes you literally could not see the hand in front of your face.
Yeah.
Like that bad, right?
Yeah.
But at least on land, I feel like I have I'm supposed to be on land.
Yes.
I'm not necessarily supposed to be in the ocean. And so you're at much more of a disadvantage in the water than you even are on land. And you're definitely at a disadvantage on land, but you're even more so in the water.
Yeah, that's what Hank and I are always talking about. And it's funny, you talk to some people and they're like, it's no different in the ocean. I mean, you know, you're not going to have any chance against a bear. You're not going to have any chance against a shark. And it's like, actually against a bear, like, yeah, I mean, if he's just full on intent to eat me and gets a hold of me, you don't have a chance really. But I could climb a tree.
Yeah.
You know, I can hit that thing with a stick or throw a rock. I mean, man, when I'm in the water, you did when you're in your story about all you can do. You punch it, and if he decides he still wants to eat you, you're out of moves.
Yeah. Yeah, you don't have, yeah.
Yeah. Did you have, when you were diving, you know, you see, you know, movies or whatever, guy running out of oxygen or doing different things. Did you have some close calls where something happened, equipment malfunction? I mean, as much as you're diving, I got to think that there's some things at times that went wrong where it's like, hey, this is a bit of a shitty situation.
Yeah, and especially when we were diving in the Philippines there, like, because we were diving so much, you become so complacent. Not necessarily the best thing, right? But you just do.
That's what they say. The most dangerous pilot is a guy that's flown for 20 years.
Yeah.
Or skydiving. You know,
right.
Andy Stumpf, like packing packing my chute again.
Yep.
And you miss that one little thing.
Yep. No, but, you know, especially diving underneath ships, water comes up and down, right? So tides, ships are higher in the water column. Sometimes they're really low near the bottom. You get tangled in stuff. It's always dark. Like I said, we dove scuba, right? So we weren't even tethered together because that would be the best way to do it. But it made things more complicated. So, yeah, I mean, lots of times, quite frankly, you know, you take that last breath and you're like, that's it. Psych a reserve valve and hope it kicks on, and you got to get out of there, you know. But nothing at the time that kind of came across as death-defying, but you would find yourself in just the absolute weirdest places. So the submarine you see on the surface, like the exterior, there's actually a submarine inside the submarine, right? And so there's like these walls and like scaffolding and baffles and ladders and stuff like that. And I mean, we would just now we would normally have something like a mask with a hose, but we'd climb and basically cave diving, climbing down back inside through these little baffles that you could barely like fit through, and like,
I'm not
just zero. You know, I clearly don't have claustrophobia. Yeah. And you would just go in there and it's just like, yeah, you're just doing it. And, but you have so much trust in the people that you're with that, you know, they're competent, you're competent, everybody's done their job. It's as safe as it can be. And you just go do it, you know?
Yeah. The claustrophobia thing, I'm not really claustrophobic. I mean, you could go lock me in a box and whatever, you know, you see that like Bud stuff, right? And this badass dude that can do everything. and you throw him in a tiny little box and throw a lid on it before the last nail's in it. The guy's like, I'm done. I quit. I'm out. Like, can't do it. Like crazy mental shit there. I could do all that, but being in the water and being feeling like in a trap situation, I think I'd probably have a problem with that.
Yeah.
But I think it's a lack of confidence of myself in the water, first of all.
That has a big part to do with it. But yeah, we definitely saw guys like over the years, they just kind of, we'll call it lost their nerve.
Snapped.
And they couldn't do it anymore. They couldn't even put a mask on their face. They're just like, I can't do this.
There were guys that way. I've heard stories. I didn't personally see it, but I worked with a guy that said they had a guy at our utility that like climbed a pole one day, and sometimes we'd climb power poles like on essentially a cliffside, steep mountainside, and you're standing at that pole and, you're on the uphill side of it and you put your tools on, and there is this one pole, and I climbed this pole. This is why I know the story, because the guy told me about it. But you're standing there, and you really can't see over this like rock ledge, and the way that you get on the pole, you're kind of like climbing up, and you don't really realize, and you spin around the pole, and it goes off into the river bottom, and it feels like you're on like a 900-foot tall pole.
Mm-hmm.
And it's weird because you're on at the top of those power poles. They get narrow, so like. They're like 6 inches in diameter. They're small. I mean, we climb some little pecker poles. It's like, my fat ass is not safe up here on this thing. It's amazing the holding power of wood. But you get up on this pole, and in your mind starts to play these tricks of like, I'm 900 feet up on a pole that's freaking 5 inches in diameter right now. And the guy got up there and snapped. Just froze. Wouldn't speak.
Yeah, now what?
We knew nothing. And it took these guys like 5 hours to get him
Wow.
off the pole. Like, guys had to climb up and like force his, spike to come out of the pole and like put it back in the pole for him. Basically forced him down the pole. And when he got to the ground, he was completely broken and quit.
Yeah.
He was done.
Yeah.
Just something went off. And he had climbed for years.
Mm-hmm.
Weird. The mind is strange
Yeah.
that way.
No, it is.
So with diving, again, you kind of go through your career. There's some other stories or experiences that you had kind of in that diving phase before you went into the training side of it, or?
No, we just, before the war, I mean, it's not like people were bored, but like we were looking for things to do. So we ended up starting to do some really cool things when I was on the West Coast as far as diving. And because I was so comfortable with it, and I was in a supervisory role now, like I was willing to help guys push the envelope to figure some things out, to like build some different tactics. So we started doing some of that stuff. That was some of the stuff I was doing out at San Clemente, where guys would, imagine guys diving underwater into a cliff area, and then from there rock climbing out of the water to get on land, right? Like in areas where an enemy wouldn't, it's not a beach, right? So it's not, no normal person or unit could be able to do this.
You don't think you would need to defend that.
Right. So that's why we wanted to try to, expose that and figure that out and try to understand that. So that's what started to slowly, again, if you have a skill set to offer, they'll accept it, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's what started to begin to blur the lines between me coming from just a water background and my transition on the land.
Yeah.
Right. Interestingly enough. And it was that lead up and just guys just wanting to push the envelope and try different things. And I'm like, yeah, we can do that. Like it's within the rules, maybe slightly gray, but like it's within the rules. Let's go try that. Right. And I think we can start to keep it safe. And because I was doing this mountain guide thing on the side, that skill set and confidence was starting to build. And so to me, I was like, whoa, this is like pretty cool. I'm starting to blend these two things, having no idea where it was eventually going to lead,
Right. So, what point in your career where were you at in your career when 9/11 happened?
So I was at SEAL Team 5 in San Diego. Like I said, I'd been there 5.5 years or whatever. So I was looking for something else to do. I think I was at 13 years in my career at the time. Mm-hmm. So I was going to stay in at that point. But Just figuring out what I want to do, because quite frankly, like I felt like I had done all this stuff, and I don't like redundancy.
Right.
So I was just kind of going through that internal kind of dialogue in my head, where I wanted to go, what I wanted to do. There were some special projects that I was starting to inquire about, and had some friends that were there that, you know, I thought maybe I'd go in that direction.
Yeah.
That would keep me in the diving world, but in this very, very specialized kind of area.
Yeah.
And then 9/11 happened.
Okay. And so is that when you started to see the switch, and like where they started to want to try and move you into more of the training with the SEALs, or?
Yeah, so that's exactly what happened. So 9/11 happens, right? Everybody's life changes. I had told you that I'd gone up to Alaska once. I'd helped a platoon. I'd taken some platoons out already in the Southern California mountains in the winter, and just started to kind of give them some exposure. I won't get into it here, but at the time there were different areas of operations, and so that particular SEAL team had more of a focus on the winter environment.
Mm-hmm.
So it just, again, it made sense, and I was learning these skill sets, and then I wanted to come back and apply it, and so it was like, so I was kind of like using these guys to teach and get some experience, and then go back and take another course as a mountain guide, right?
Yeah.
And everybody loved it because it was something new, it was unique, right? It wasn't that redundancy. 9/11 happens. I get a call a couple days later from the guy who was running the training unit in Alaska, and he's, basically he said, I got to pull together 12 guys. I get to pick who I want. You got to be here in a month, because we have to start figuring how to get guys in Afghanistan like this winter. Understanding, not at the time, that the training, so some of the stuff I was doing with just the SEAL Team 5 guys was about the most relevant training on the West Coast that was going on in regards to the winter.
Okay.
Just didn't even know it, right? Just
Yeah.
completely on our own almost. Jules and I, we had just had an apartment, so.
And she's in the military at this point too, right?
She's in the Air Force.
Yeah.
So just said, and she's like, no, I can transfer up to Anchorage.
Mm-hmm.
There's a big Air Force base there. And anyways, in a month, we were in Alaska and hit the ground running. Literally, there was already a platoon up there. Guys from Team 5 knew them. Drove in, took a ferry in, and literally started working the next day. And for the next, my gosh, man, like, it's hard to remember, but there were no days off for years after that.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, because the institutional knowledge of winter and mountain warfare had essentially aged its way out of at least the Navy, right? The Army still had some stuff going on. But of course, the Army, the Navy doesn't want the Army to tell them what to do.
Between
right?
Vietnam and then
the desert,
especially the desert, the Gulf War, all that stuff. Like,
nobody expected the next war to be in the Hindu Kush.
Yeah,
they just didn't, and it took everybody by surprise. So not only did they not have the training, the tactics, so TTPs they called them, they didn't have any of the clothing, the equipment. They didn't have any of that. What those guys were teaching in Alaska was really more focused toward like Northern Asia, coastal Northern Asia, China, North Korea, that kind of thing,
mm-hmm.
right? This was wholly different. This was high altitude, rugged mountains in the winter.
Mountaineering with a rifle.
So just super privileged to get up there again, because I had been taking those classes, those courses. I had some of the most updated, relevant information just from a technical aspect, not how to apply it in a military setting,
mm-hmm.
but the technical side of it. And so, again, kind of a hand-picked team of like, I think about 12 guys. Here we go again, right? With super fine focused, and we're like basically given a blank check and said, figure it out and make it quick. So that first winter, those guys went in Afghanistan. It was a shit show.
Yeah,
it was. They just didn't have the right gear, and they made it work, right? But we knew that wasn't sustainable.
Did you bring some of them guys? Were you in constant communication, like bringing them back and like what's working, what's more importantly, what's not working?
Yeah, so you'd get after action reports on the classified side, and you could read them, and you could understand you could start to get an idea of what was going on, what wasn't, where the weak points were, how the enemy reacted, how we needed to kind of build that out.
Were you actively involved with, like changing the actual gear, like the apparel that they're wearing? Did you start working with
all of it?
Did you?
All of it, yeah. Yeah, that was the cool thing, so now this sets like the course for the rest of my military career, which was started working with industry, some of the best outdoor brands in the business, some of the best designers in that business, some of the best field testers. So that's where Dwight and those guys come in, and going, how do we do this? Like, not like how do we do this 10 years ago when there was no war going on, but how the fuck do we really do this? Because this is for real, and guys are dying, and it's unacceptable, and we have to, how do we become the premier force to do this, right? And so, again, that focus was laser. Like, there was no BS about it, right? So, everybody was just very patriotic at the time, as you can imagine. And so the cool thing was you began to develop this feedback loop where you would ask people, then you'd get something, you'd try it, you'd test it, and then eventually we were to the point where, like, okay, now we can begin to teach. So then you'd teach. So these are guys that had just come back from overseas, guys that were just going. Then you started getting a mixture of guys who were new and somewhat experienced, and you started to teach and go, okay, that worked, that didn't work, that was dumb. Let's try it again. We tested on ourselves, and we just kept doing that. And so that feedback loop of information is really where I hate the term, but it probably applies, where I became a subject matter expert in this stuff, because it's all I did. And like, if I needed to know the best way to climb something, we just called the best climber, and we're like, teach us how to do this, right? Or mindset, or skiing, or whatever, or clothing. It's like, hey, we need the best materials. I mean, companies just started, Primaloft and Polar Tech, and they just started coming out, and they're like, hey, man, we got this stuff. Like, it's not even public yet. Like, come and look at this. Will this help you guys? And if it did, we bought it, right? When I say we, like the government.
Right.
But, like, we were able to shepherd in so many new technologies into what became commercialized for the civilian later. We were just getting them and testing them and then throwing it out and then going again.
It had to have been, like you say, basically no days off for years, but it had to have been incredibly, like, motivating to, I mean, it couldn't have been hard to get out of bed in the morning. I'm sure you were just,
not for me,
so excited to, well, I don't know, excited, but also really, I'm sure you felt a sense of responsibility or duty that you needed to figure this shit out as soon as possible, because it was, people's lives were on the line. Like, while you're teaching this, there's guys that are struggling in that very moment somewhere on a mountain.
Yeah, I mean, it was happening. You could read it. You had, you knew guys. Guys were getting hurt. Guys were getting killed. All of a sudden, it was becoming very real, right? Yeah. I knew, you hear people say this, and I always kind of questioned them in the past, but it's like, I can't imagine that I wasn't anywhere except exactly where I needed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do.
Yeah.
Like, everything I had, even though there was a weird diving thing, right? Small teams, focused, like figuring it out, being a little unconventional. Everything I was doing was leading to that point. And then I realized I was exactly where I needed to be to make the biggest impact. That ultimately, so yeah, you want the fun, you want the adventure, you want to serve your country, all those things I said I wanted to do. Ultimately, the other thing I realized is, in those small teams I was always on, I could have the most positive impact on the mission, the team, the guys, whatever. And like, that's my sweet spot. Like, I don't want to be in that big team. I want to be in that small team that has a really big impact.
I know you were running SEAL teams through, but were you also getting like Ranger teams? Were the other branches of the military sending guys up?
Not to the extent that they were sending the SEAL teams. What started to happen was, we started to form up what was called mobile training teams. So So you'll hear the term MTT, where we would start to travel now to teach guys either certain skill sets or in certain environments. And that's when we started teaching, like, and I probably have the terms wrong, so forgive me, whoever knows better, but like a little element from the Rangers who were maybe involved in reconnaissance, right? Or some of the PJs. We started working with some special forces guys, but they still do have a very robust winter warfare program, to the point where, you know, when things started to let up a little, maybe 2008, I forget, we started going, I went through and took, you know, the Green Beret, you know, senior and master level mountaineering, you know, master mountaineering courses or whatever they called them from those guys. So we started doing cross-pollination work then. So you could have guys from different units on the same team, and they had the same language, they had the same lingo, which maybe that seemed obvious or seems obvious now. It was absolutely not the case back then, right? So then that started to happen, and then that cross-pollination, we started going down and working out of Pickle Meadows so it'd be south of Tahoe. So that's a big Marine Corps training facility. We started going and working out of there, not really with the Marines, but the Marines, you know, they say, hey, we sent a couple guys from they didn't have the, what do they call them now? Raiders. Anyways, they didn't have the MARSOC. They didn't have MARSOC yet, but they'd send some guys, and, you know, we would just work together. So that started to happen. But, yeah, by the end of it, I basically had taught people from every particular branch of special operations at one point or another, for something. You know, it became, how do we cross rivers in the dark in areas where nobody's ever crossed a river before, right? Because Alexander the Great figured it out, and that's where all the, you know, observation posts are. So they're going to see us coming. How do we do it somewhere else, you know? And we started trying to figure out weird shit like that. You know, and that's really where, like, I really enjoyed that kind of thing. And that's where you start to become really competent, because you're like, I don't really know how to do this, but I've got this bag of tricks here, and I think we can figure it out.
Right. It's what kind of, I'm trying to think of how best to say it, because there's so much you guys did, but, like, what are some examples of some of the training that you guys did, like, for example, and I kind of went through this at that Winter Strong, but, like, say, like, a rewarming drill, like, what's an example of something where Navy SEAL guy's got all his kit on, got all his stuff, punches through the ice, right? Falls in a creek, or, you know, edge of a creek gives out, and he's fully immersed. It's 10 degrees outside or 0. He falls in that water. Were you guys running those guys through where you were making them, hey, jump off in this lake, get completely soaking wet, and then how do you build a fire? What do you do? Do you take off? You know, because I know before I went through that rewarming drill, and I think a lot of what this guy taught, quite frankly, he had gotten from you. It was from a clothing company, Beyond.
Oh, yeah.
But he basically had everybody get in the water completely soaking wet.
Yeah.
And if you'd asked me before that, hey, you fall in the water, what are you going to do? I would say immediately before I took this, I'd get out as fast as possible and start digging through my shit and start trying to build a fire, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, the way he taught it, at least, and I really want to go through, like, a couple of these things with you, because I think it was super interesting and super applicable to what hunters are doing, which is why you are doing what you're doing now. You know, his point was, no, man, like, you got to get out and get your engine going and take off walking, hiking, whatever, and get some heat building up.
Yep.
To get to the point where you have enough energy and enough wherewithal in your brain to then dig through your shit and get a fire going in a shelter. And
Yep. Yeah. So the reason I'm smiling is I just did this last weekend. I filmed it.
That must be where you were when I texted you, because
it was.
I texted John. We were in Bozeman for basketball, and I text John. I'm like, hey, let's get together and have a beer if you're around. And it's shit weather. It was shit weather that weekend in Bozeman. Cold. And I get a text back from John in the middle of the wilderness right now, maybe whatever, another day or something. And I'm like, of course, John, in March, when it's like the worst weather possible, is in the wilderness right now.
Yeah, so what you didn't know is I did that 4 days of ski touring. We slept out. We were testing gear. I had a buddy who doesn't know a lot of that, so kind of walking him through some of that stuff. And then to kind of culminate, and I'll tie this together, but to culminate that, I had a guy who films for me ready, and we came down after that 4 days, and we went and did a rewarming drill. And so I won't claim because it's a team. I really like the teams I were on is what did it, not any one person, right? But the team I was on created what is now somewhat uniformly known as the rewarming drill, right? Mm-hmm. It used to be, prior to 9/11, just a giant kick in the dick.
Yeah.
I think Andy's talked about this, where when you went to Alaska, it was a rite of passage. You went and got in the ocean, you got balls cold, and then you went and jumped in the hot tub, okay?
Yeah. I love that. That sounds how I would like to do it.
But when you're training guys, now when you know you're going into a winter environment, very uncompromising, and you've now built an entire clothing and equipment system that's getting issued, and you understand the performance of that, and you understand how it's going to perform and save people's lives. Now you can take the next step and go, all right, now to assure you of that, we're going to put you through this drill. And so it became the rewarming drill. What I will take credit for is I was the one, as far as I know, if anybody wants to discuss it with me, I'm more than welcome to give the credit, but I am the one that brought that into the hunting industry, okay? Because I saw that there was no difference, really, I'll say very little, between a special operations guy and a backcountry hunter when you're in the shit, right? You probably can't get out of there. You can call for help. Doesn't mean somebody's going to come get you. And really, you either can't compromise the mission or you don't want to compromise your hunt. But what do? And so you have to figure out the survival priorities. And
even if you call for help, like, you have to keep yourself alive.
You do, and that's just because you call for help doesn't mean somebody's coming to get you, depending on the weather and the air asset or whatever it may be.
And even if they're coming as fast as possible, they're still at least probably 2 hours out, if not.
Yeah, and you could be hypothermic or on the verge of death by then. Yeah. So that was something that we used to do at the end of a 4-day training exercise. Very similar to what I just described they did last week. But, so you're out, you're moving around, they're living off the land, they're not living off the land, they have a pack and everything. But, and then when they come out, right, when they extract, so they're kind of 4 days in, they're tired, they're over it, they've probably been not organizing their pack like they should, they're a little bit of a shit show, right, just kind of is what it is. Then you're like, all right, boys, drop your packs on the side of the ocean or the river or the lake, whatever it may be. We preferred freshwater. Cut a hole in the ice if that's what it took. It was very scripted. They just didn't know that. Like, we knew the water temp. We knew, based on the training we had done as instructors, swallowing RFID chips and everything, that if the water temp was this, you could keep them in this long. Generally, it would knock their core body temp down to 1 or 2 degrees, right? So not in death, but enough to drive some urgency. And then we would walk through this exercise. Now, we had briefed it. We had talked to them about it, but now they were actually going to execute it, right? And so you have to figure it out, and you have to make sure that, hopefully you can do it with a buddy. But when you do this, the confidence you gain in yourself, in your gear, is almost immeasurable, right? Because you're going out in the middle of nowhere. It's, say, in a hunting situation. Like, you could be out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, hell, you could be up on that hill, but if you don't have comms, like, you're not going to be able to hike back here before you drop dead, so you're going to have to figure it out over there on your own. Mm-hmm. And so this is what we did in the military, and then this is what we brought into the hunting industry. So Yeah, it's called the rewarming drill. It's amazing when people see that, and I just wrote about this in, let's see, yeah, it came out this month in my newsletter. But this actually happened to one of our instructors where it was really nasty winter day. We were going in for a 3 or 4 day patrol. We were 4 different groups coming in from 4 different parts of the compass. We were going to link up in one central spot and then, get everybody out to an extract. He was the back person in the patrol. They were going up a creek. That ice gave way. He plunged in armpit deep. It was high winds, temps in the teens, without the wind chill. He had to immediately execute with his guys a rewarming drill to save his life. And he did. And not only did he do that, but the next day, so we'll just call it 12 hours, he continued the exercise, and he linked up with us a little late, but he got there.
Yeah.
So, if you don't figure it out, you become a statistic, and you don't want to do that.
Yeah.
And you don't have to nowadays. The amazing thing nowadays is the performance of all this gear, especially if you have a little bit of knowledge and train and just make sure it fits your style. You don't have to necessarily just call it quits.
Right. Well, that's kind of the point of what he was doing that day, was showing that the clothing that was on your body was a gigantic factor also in your ability to get dry and warm and continue on with, the mission. Some of the technical gear, and I'll do an intro before this podcast, but like, you work at Sitka gear.
Yeah.
The gear, its ability to dry and to pull moisture away from your skin and to dry relatively quickly, to dry even on your own body from your own body heat, compared to cotton and the stuff that I grew up wearing hunting, which just once you sweated it up, it was wet the entire time.
Yeah. No, me too. I mean, yeah.
It was absolutely incredible how you could use your body heat to dry that shit and to warm yourself up a bit, and then obviously at that point trying to get a fire going and actually dry things.
Yeah, so let's talk through that just a little bit, because I get there's lots of obvious questions people ask, and they're like, okay, well, I get wet, got it, ice cold, middle of nowhere, check. I'm going to seek shelter. So your first survival priority is seeking shelter, right? So shelter at its most basic is clothing. So you could put more clothing on, like your puffy jacket or rain gear, something to block the wind, trap your body heat, so that you can either build a shelter, right, whatever that may be, a tarp or a lean-to or something, or set up your tent.
Puffy jacket right over the top of your wet clothing?
100%. So there's a lot to it.
So don't stand there and take the time to take off 3 layers of wet gear.
Right. So I'll get back to that wet gear in a second, but if you understand how your body loses heat, then you understand how to counter those forces, right? And so if your first priority is to be, I'm going to strip down naked. So first of all, I never carry anything extra except some liner gloves and socks. I never carry any extra clothing because I know what it does, how it works, right? So I'm not even going to have extra clothing to put on. So I'm not going to take it off to leave it off. You want to insulate yourself. That's what the puffy jacket does. If you have the right puffy jacket, it'll manage the moisture. But you need to trap body heat from leaving you so that you don't continue to spiral down. You spiral down, not only do you, your hands and stuff don't start to work very well. You can only do gross motor skills, but your mind starts to make bad decisions. So one bad decision leads to another. And then you can maybe even put rain gear on to like block the wind, depending on how long it's going to take you to set up your shelter. Boom, set up your tent, jump inside. Okay, once you're inside and you've got your pack there, you're like, okay, do I have things stable? I'm wet. I'm probably still real cold, but have I improved my situation? I'm out of the wind. I'm trapping some heat. I got a shelter. Like, I can weather the storm, right? Either the external storm or the internal storm. Then you can go, all right, now what do I do? All right, so maybe put your ground pad down, sleeping bag, climb inside the whole thing. Try to reverse.
Still wet clothes on.
Try to reverse that heat loss, because hypothermia is when your body loses heat quicker than you can add heat back, right? And so when it hits 95, and then eventually you go into a coma and you die. So get in there, and you're like, boom, I'm as insulated as I can be. I'm out of the elements. First survival priority check. Second is, let me revert this heat loss. So I'm going to warm up some water. I'm going to start drinking warm fluids. If they have some calories in there, great, because that's going to crank your metabolism.
Mm-hmm.
Your body here, this part of our body, our internal organs, that is an internal combustion engine, just like you have in your truck. This runs on food and water. That truck runs on diesel, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you eat a meal and you get hot and you're like, yeah, I got to open up my shirt or whatever, that's your body building that body heat from metabolism. That's what you want. This is the most reliable source of heat you have. We'll get to the fire, but the fire is not, because depending on the condition and your training, like, you may not be able to get a fire going quickly.
Right.
So let's rely on what we have. Hot fluids, okay, good. Now let me eat something. Do I have a candy bar? Do I have a food bar? Some quick, simple calories. Then can I consume a meal? Do I have that? Okay, now I'm packing more calories on. The body's starting to pump. If you have the right clothing system, and this is the beautiful thing about modern textiles, that heat source, because that's the heat, it's going to push heat out and take the moisture with it.
Huh.
And even though you have that puffy jacket on, that puffy jacket should be able to manage the moisture that's going to eventually build up in it and the sleeping bag. And that could be wet for the next. I mean, I've been on trips where that puffy gear was wet and sleeping bag like damp for 5 days. Wasn't the most comfortable. I'm not telling you it's the most comfortable, but you're not. Right. But you're warm and you're not going to die. And at a certain point, you're like, well, that's better than the alternative, right? Once you get that done, go, okay, now can I start? Now you should be warm enough, calm, situation under control. Can I take my pants off and wring any water out? Yeah. Do I have an extra base layer top that I could put on? Maybe you do have a second change of clothes. Go ahead and change them out. This is a classic mistake everybody wants to make. Fuck, I'm cold. I'm wet. This sucks. It's miserable. I'm going to take everything off. I'm going to ball it up and put it in the vestibule of the tent.
Right.
Or the down at the foot of the A-frame, and I'm going to deal with it in the morning.
Right.
And in the morning,
it's a frozen.
You're going to wake up and you're going to be warm, you're going to be dry, and you're going to be fucked, because now that clothing is worse off than it was if you'd have just kept it on your body.
Yep.
Now it's a frozen mass.
Yep.
Now it's a cold, wet clump. You're still going to have to put it on and dry it out.
Right.
Now, maybe the weather's great the next day and you can just lounge around and like lay your stuff out. Military guys don't have that option, right? Mm-hmm. If you're on a hunt with the tagging of a lifetime in your pocket, are you going to give up the best weather day to dry your stuff out?
Right.
Or are you going to try to figure out these processes, right? So we all have to kind of figure it out. But at that point, I'm like, okay, I'd wrung it out. There's not going to be a lot of water anyways. I'm going to put it back on. I'm going to ride the night out. Now that I've got everything stabilized, I'm going to go ahead and potentially make a fire, right? Yeah. And then you're going to realize, people can realize quickly that depending on the environment, so that Pacific Northwest, that coastal Alaska, depending on the time of year, quite frankly, you may not be able to make a fire. And what I mean by that is, yeah, you'll be able to strike a match. Yeah, you'll be able to get some tinder going and some twigs, but you're not going to get a fire to produce enough life-giving warmth that it's going to be worth the shit. It's going to give you maybe some psychological warmth, but it's really not going to do a lot for you.
Right.
But if your first course of action is, I'm going to build a fire, just like the old Jack London story, and you don't, you've given up, that critical time where you could have gotten out of the elements and started to stop that heat loss.
Right.
But once you get that fire going, and there's a whole process in that, and then you have to figure out, I need to make a fire now that's going to give me warmth and start to warm up. And then you can go, all right, depending on the weather, if it's good, it's like, now I can maybe take my shirt off and dry it out around the fire. Now I maybe can take my pants off. Now I can maybe stand with my backside to that fire and slowly dry out. But it's a several steps to get there. It's not the first place you start.
So when you come out of that water, are you saying generally immediately jump into that pack of yours and look for that shelter and get that shelter up? Or are you saying that maybe you go walk for a second and try to build up a little bit of body heat. Is that a wrong thing to do, or are you immediately, because you kind of went straight to the shelter?
Yep. Great question. It's really going to depend on several factors. So if I'm out for the day and you and I are an hour and a half from the truck, right? And you fall in, or I fall in, I'm crossing a log and I fall in, I'm up to my waist, boom, I'm wet. What do I do? So depending on the weather, I could maybe just say, hey, bro, I'm going to throw on my puffy jacket and my beanie,
Right.
and like, you lead, you navigate.
But we're heading to the truck.
We need to head to the truck because we're improving our position. We're cutting the distance. We're getting closer to safety. And there's a good chance, because I have help, we're going to get out, okay? Yeah. If we both fall off the back of a raft in coastal Alaska on a moose hunt and completely submerge all our shit and eddy out with the boat, we have to set up camp right then and there, okay? So that's a different scenario.
Yeah.
Because we're not getting, we are home, right, in that regard. But so the tent setup and all that's what I refer to as a static rewarming drill. There's something called the dynamic warming drill, which I use the dynamic rewarming drill for training, for testing clothing and textiles, but it's also probably the most applicable to what people would probably do in most situations. So let's say we take horses in. We're 8 miles in. We drop off, we set up base camp, we take our day packs, and now we're out hunting mule deer. And we run into this scenario, right? Storm rolls over the top, afternoon sun, thunderstorm, snowstorm. Before we can get our rain gear, maybe we didn't bring it, we're completely soaked. I'm not going to build an A-frame if I'm 2 miles from our camp.
Right.
We're going to start making our way back there, right? When you do that, you start to immediately crank the metabolic engine, the internal combustion engine, and create heat. And all of a sudden, you're like, oh, I was shivering. 5 minutes down the trail, you're like, oh, you know what? I'm actually warm. I'm wet. I'm kind of miserable, but I'm warm.
Right.
Matter of fact, I might have to slow down my pace because I'm starting to sweat too much, which is counterproductive to the cause.
Right.
So that's normally the case. It's like, boom, get wet. How are we going to do things? We're going to improve our position. We're just going to start moving.
Yeah.
But if you get wet and you get out and you start doing jumping jacks and you don't put your puffy on, you're not figuring out how to build your shelter, depending on the weather conditions and, quite frankly, the person and their physiology, you may be giving up those golden 10, 15 minutes to even have the opportunity to do that.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I guarantee your hands have been cold enough, like you can't even barely work a bit lighter, right?
Yeah, 100%.
So, you know, you got to figure these things out. And I'm just a proponent of having the understanding, training with the gear, and figuring out what works best for you based on some best practices that, you know, a bunch of people have kind of figured out over the years.
So as you're doing that training up there, how long were you up there doing that in Alaska?
I want to tell you 13 years.
13 years.
Yeah, so almost half my career, actually half my career, I spent up there. Yeah, I spent 20 years with the SEAL teams out of 26, and 13 of that was up there figuring all that stuff out.
So that first 6 years you talk about basically no days off. Was it about halfway through that time up there that you started really seeing like that progress? Like, okay, we're getting our after action reports and like things are really starting to pay off. Did you start to, instead of developing and feeling like you were almost behind the 8 ball so much, like halfway through, did you start seeing like, okay, what we're doing is working. We're less behind the 8 ball now. It's just more of teaching new guys all the time.
Yeah. So what started to happen was, one, the war shifted, right? We were in Iraq, we were in southern Afghanistan, but we started getting instructors coming back that we had put through as new guys.
Yeah.
And now they were coming back from a couple deployments, and now they were bringing that experience into the instructor cadre, and then they were starting to pump that information out, right? So that started to happen. Clearly people started to understand and figure out how to use the gear, what they were doing. Everything was getting lighter. So absolutely, to the point, Josh, where I would tell you that before the war, the military and technology for clothing and equipment just in general, we were probably 20 years behind the outdoor industry. I would tell you that, yeah, somewhere probably halfway through, and certainly, well, I can't say now, but certainly halfway through, we had caught up and in some places surpassed the outdoor industry as far as technology and how to use it, because we had brands coming to us, Polartec, Primaloft, Gore-Tex, all of them, and they're like, hey man, like this is something you guys should look at. And maybe it's not commercially viable because of the price right now, but like this is the best we've got.
Right.
And we're like, oh yeah, no, we need that. Like Polartec Alpha is a perfect example of that. Polartec Alpha that, people may know now, Sitka used it for years. We helped them commercialize that by adopting that into our protective combat uniform before it was ever a thing. So things like that started to happen, and then we started to surpass the outdoor industry, and I think probably now it's at parity. But
well, and obviously it's a huge deal for those companies to get the military using their stuff. It's a big deal money-wise from a contract side, and then it's a huge credibility, from a credibility standpoint to be able to say, like, highest trained dudes in the world are using this stuff, because obviously if, the feeling is like, well, if the Navy SEALs can go to the Hindu Kush and use it, I can use it in Idaho on a bear hunt.
Yeah. We used to do a really cool, so as the training evolved, we eventually started teaching a survival block of training, kind of a maritime survival block of training, right? Because we were near the ocean, but, guys would swim in, they'd have dry suits on, and then from there, depending on what they were doing, the weather, et cetera, they'd transition out of that dry suit. Sometimes they'd stay in it. But anyways, for 4 days, they would live off the land. We would teach them how to live off the land, right? And we sometimes would provide them, a rabbit, a deer through the state of Alaska. We could hunt year round for that purpose. But if they, caught one in a snare or whatever trap they had, they could certainly consume it. But they did that for 4 days, and then their final training exercise, right, before they had to put the dry suit back on and swim back out in the ocean, was to build a fire and take we gave them their packs back at this point. They had to take their cook pot, 1 liter of water. They had to build a fire with 1 liter of water and bring that to a boil. So you had to build a fire with a big enough heat source to boil that liter of water. The incentive being that if they did, they got their first dehydrated meal essentially of the week. So, there was a big incentive to do that. And it didn't matter. It didn't effing matter if there was 18 inches of slush on the ground. Figure it out.
Right.
And sometimes, because we are there to teach. We're not there to just negatively enforce everything. But, like, I'm down there on my knees, too, like, in the slush, like, showing that guy, like, you got to do this, you got to do that, got to think about this. Remember this principle. Understand that. Not everybody passed. The vast majority did. But those were some of the things we started to do, and then fast forward to Sitka, and they're like, hey, we want to build this. Now, obviously, Sitka's owned by Gore, or not obviously, but it is. Who has Gore-Tex, and they're like, oh, we want to do this thing, we want to build this wader, this and that. What do you think? And I'm like, I may or may not still have my dry suit or one of my dry suits from that training, and I brought it in. I said, you see this? I said, I saw thousands of dudes, to include myself, trust our lives to this. We'd swim in, we'd spend 4 days, we'd do all this crazy shit, we'd put it back on, we'd swim back out. I said, I think this laminate is probably a good one to start to build our wader. I think there's a lot of field testing here that, and so just that constant, like, back and forth between, military and private industry has been a really good thing over the last 20 years.
Yeah. So at Sitka, kind of fast forward, and you've done the cold weather training. What's the specific name of what you were doing up there? Was it cold weather survival school or cold?
God damn it. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Cold weather maritime survival school or survival training. Or
so
something like that.
You're getting out of the military.
You'd think I'd know, but I'm old now, so
yeah. You've hit your 20 years. You're getting out of the military.
26. Yeah,
26 years, and your wife too. So again,
yeah. So Jules did 28. Yeah, she eventually retired out of the Air National Guard in Anchorage.
Yeah, she's a badass too.
Yeah,
that's wild. Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing.
So the cool thing, just quick side note. So the cool thing was, so I'm doing all this stuff for the teams and special operations, right? My wife's in the Air Force, in the Air Guard, and she's a air crew, right?
Mm-hmm.
She's a combat photographer, but they call it air crew. So you have to be trained to, like, you know, jump out of airplanes and all this kind of, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, what? And she's going to all these survival schools. She went to desert and water and Arctic survival school. And so, you know, it wasn't, I don't want to demean what they did, but they were doing it on a bigger scale. So it wasn't quite to the same level with, you know, all the gear we had. But she was doing all these things. So I could come back and I was like, oh, how'd you do? She goes, well, you know, with the Arctic survival school, it was, I think when she did it, was -50.
Oh,
you know? So I'm like,
damn.
yeah, I don't know if I even want to do that when it's
No
-50, you know?
No
It's
doubt.
like,
No doubt. You know, and before we move into like Sitka and what you're doing now, there was a Green Beret I was talking to the other day that's active that was just about to come to Montana. His team was already here, but they were about to do a big movement through from right where I grew up there, basically close in Lincoln, but more from Ovando.
oh, yeah.
We're going to go from Ovando to the Canadian line through the Bob Marshall Wilderness 2 weeks ago. There's a lot of goddamn snow back there right now.
Man, I love that stuff.
Isn't that cool?
Yeah.
So his whole team was going to do a movement through the Bob Marshall. And they were going to be here a little while, and then they were headed to Alaska to do training. And those guys, and I think they were going to try and do it in 4 or 5 days. 4 or 5 days. And again,
Yeah, I don't know how many miles that is, but that's quite a
it was like
quite a movement.
110,
yeah.
something like that. Because when you look at a map, it's not that far from Ovando to Canada. But when you
look at a map,
when you look at a topo map,
Yeah.
and then you start realizing the elements that are between Ovando and Canada, like, holy shit.
right?
Like, it's some of the most rugged country that the lower 48 has. And again, we're talking about, I basically right now is when the Bob Marshall Wilderness is loaded with the absolute most snow. We've had a whole entire winter full of snow. We've had spring storms. There really isn't a time that the Bob Marshall Wilderness is going to have more snow than right now.
Right.
And, you know, people who don't live in snow country, like, just go run on the beach. But now make that sand, you know, up to your knees, maybe your waist, and try and push through that and carry a pack. And they're doing it all survive off the land. You know, they're going to pack as much food as they can pack, but they're also doing. He was talking about how they were going through like snaring classes and trapping classes, and all of their training, he said, has really morphed a lot with this new threat that we have of a potential war where even the packs, everything that they had, like in Afghanistan and Iraq, everything's changed. Their gear's changing, their packs, the amount of, like he said, everything over there, they used to strip things way down, be super stripped down.
Yeah. Because of the altitude.
And now it's, you got to put as much stuff on your back as you can to potentially survive for weeks. And it's super interesting to hear. And I was thinking about this when I was talking to him with what they're doing right now. It's got to be kind of cool from your perspective. Like, you know that you've contributed to all of that training that they're even doing right now today. And they're taking what you did and expanding on it and improving on it. It's got to be pretty cool.
Yeah, it is. I stay in touch with some guys, and, you know, some guys that are still active, and I know that this winter more than any other, for some maybe obvious reasons and maybe some that aren't so obvious to even me, but the winter training, I've never seen it ramped up like this ever. Like,
yeah.
Not that I'm even aware of back in, you know, 02, 03, 04. I wished I was a part of it, to be honest with you. Like,
yeah.
I am proud that at least I had some part in that. You know, I'm maybe not even merely a footnote at this point, but I wish I was still back in the game, because, like, that thing you described going through the Bob Marshall, like I live for that, and I know that I've still got something to contribute, right? Like, maybe my body's broke down, but
Do you ever think of advising and contracting back to because, I mean, right now it seems like everyone knows that this is the skill set and potentially the war front that we might be on. You know, Russia, Ukraine,
right?
You know, Siberia.
Yeah. Well, it's funny how things just come full circle, because you know that was kind of like Cold War stuff back in the day, like when they had like legitimate in the 80s and 90s, like legitimate, you know, whole teams were cold weather teams, you know, Army and Navy, where they were doing some crazy stuff that we never did. We didn't need to do at the time. But you know, it's like almost coming full circle again. But it's an interesting thing, because all these things that I've talked about, like everything's perishable. You know, diving, climbing, the winter thing, like it's all perishable if you don't do it. Land navigation, right? Shooting, all of it. And so you can only do so much in a given period of time. And so it's like, if that's the focus right now, they will go get really good at it. But, you know, I love it so much that I've never walked away from it. I just, you know, kind of on the periphery anyways, but been working on it. But like, yeah, that stuff excites me, that guys are still going out and doing that. Because it's
the other thing
it's
that
needed.
He was saying that they're going to do in Alaska is super high altitude jumping, and in super cold conditions.
Kind of well, not altitude aside, kind of like what those guys did in Antarctica.
Yeah. Like he said, jumping out and trying to figure out, I think he was telling me one of the jumps that he did here just recently, coming out and realizing that basically all your electronics that the military counts on for, you know, and don't know the terminology, but understand your altitude and all your different things. Like you jump out and all that shit just basically dead. And I believe it because I wasn't like some superstar lineman or whatever, but we did have a storm a couple years before I quit working, where we had to take a snowcat up Mount Sentinel, kind of Paddy Canyon here in Missoula, above the university. There's a 911 tower up there, right up on top, and it just takes a beating, you know, with the wind and whatnot. Well, we had incredibly cold weather here that winter. It's like 25 below in town. We had a huge storm going on. It actually became national news because what resulted from the storm a couple of days later was a really bad avalanche that came right down through, like a half a mile from the interstate, came down through all them homes and killed a couple people and took some homes out right on Van Buren Street, like in town. And so anyway, in the middle of that storm, we got called out. We took this snowcat up on the mountain, and we kind of made this plan. We got up there, the wires broke, and my foreman was like, all right, Josh, we're going to get out. You're going to get your tools on. You're going to go up the pole. Chris is going to run out down to the next pole and dig the wire out of the snow. It's laying in the snow down there somewhere. He's going to pull it out. He's going to run it back, and then my foreman was going to be at the base of the pole I'm climbing, getting our hoists and our stuff ready to stick on the wire, the sleeve, and all that stuff. When Chris gets back with the wire, we're going to put the sleeve and the hoist and everything on, and then we're going to run it to Josh. Josh is going to sleeve it. All right, that's the plan.
Sounds like a great plan.
And it is. And, and we had our mechanic with us because in the beginning of the story, we had a brand new snowcat, and we had gone off to head out on this task, and within a half a mile, our snowcat was blowing out black smoke and was like out of power. So we had tracked back, went back to town, called the mechanic in. This is like a Saturday. He came in a brand new snowcat, but they had run the air intake for the engine incorrectly, and they ran it down where the air that makes the engine breathe is coming from underneath. Well, this thing's made to run in multiple feet of powder snow. So he reroutes it and basically end up like duct taping it to the side of the cab just to make it work for the day, where the air intake is up top. But we're like, hey man, with the weather conditions, if we have another problem with this snowcat up on the mountain, like we might die. Like it's that kind of weather. So we need you to come with us. He loads all his winter gear. He comes along. So we're at that pole. And I told the mechanic, I'm like, hey man, I want you to video this because this is going to be fucking epic. And hand him my phone. Sure enough, jump out of snowcat, get our stuff on. And it was blown between 70 and 80 right Jesus. In there. Absolutely howling. I get all my gear on, and I start. And when you climb a pole, you have to climb with the wind into your face, because if you try to climb with your back to it, if you turn at all and the wind catches your body, it'll blow you around the pole.
Oh, wow.
And so I put my face, and you got to keep all your skin covered. I put my face covering over and just tuck my hard hat down. Actually, well, I didn't have my hard hat, just my winter cap. There's no OSHA up there. I'm not wearing a hard hat. Tuck it all down, and I just start climbing that pole. And there's a bracket up there where this wire's supposed to mount to. So normally you're looking up and you want to be safe and you just want to look where you're going. But in those kind of conditions, everything's dead power-wise. I just started climbing until I just ran into it, Mm-hmm. And so I'm climbing. As I get up there, I hear screaming down on the ground, like just this yelling. And I like pull my face covering down. I look down. And Chris, he's big rugby player, big dude. He's like screaming at our foreman, yelling at him to get in the snowcat. And finally, Chris like grabs him and manhandles him and like pushes him physically to the snowcat. Chris runs and gets the wire. I'm sitting up there freezing to death waiting. I go to drop my ropes to him, and as soon as I drop my ropes, they just blow out like at a 90. And they're just out stiff. I have to suck all my ropes back in. I tie my hammer to it, drop it down. He runs everything up, and I fix the wire. Get back down to the ground. We get back in the snowcat. It was, it was freaking awesome. And I'm like, hey, what the hell? What was the deal with you shoving Randy back in here? Well, Randy had, he's older. He's probably 60 or so, and he had forgotten his face covering. In just the amount of time it took me to get my tools on and start climbing, and Chris to get some tools out, his face was becoming frostbit, and Randy couldn't see it or feel it. Chris was seeing it happen, and Chris was like, dude, you can't be out here. And so I asked my mechanic, I'm like, let's see the video. And he's like, well, dude, your battery must have been dead. He's like, I started videoing your he's like, I wasn't out there a minute and a half, 2 minutes. Your phone died. So we get back to town, and as we were in the cab and whatnot, we go to a restaurant to have dinner. I start getting like my phone's vibrating. I pull it open. It's at 80% battery life. Just being outside for like 2 or 3 minutes, that electronic device had completely killed that battery, just killed that device. And so it's a long story to get back to the point of like, when you guys are out in these cold weather conditions, or you got dudes jumping out of airplanes at 80 below zero, 90 below zero at that altitude, with wind, like it's a whole nother element with cold and wet conditions, especially for days and weeks on end, to know that, like, I know when I go hunting, the amount of batteries that you would potentially have to take if you're taking extra batteries for everything, especially in that cold weather, in the military's perspective, like, you might be out 2 weeks on one of these missions, potentially.
Yeah.
That's what these guys are training for. And he even said, like, testing batteries. They have new battery technology they're testing.
I hope so. I mean, when you get into that cold winter environment, and I used to tell guys, I'm like, that environment has a better chance of killing you than the enemy, because
100%.
You're in it. Like 100% you're in that environment. You have no choice. You have to figure this out. And so there's so many, you have to be very disciplined, and there's so many things you have to figure out. So, yourself is one thing. I wrote about this a couple months ago, but it's like taking care of yourself is one thing. At a certain point, it becomes a given. Now you get to the point where it's like, I'm capable of taking care of myself. Now I'm going to look out for my buddy. And then if everybody does that, then at least you have somebody looking out for each other. But then it's like, what, I've seen frostbite. I've had guys get frostbite, but that is a self-inflicted error. That makes, you made yourself that casualty.
Yeah,
right?
Forgetting your face shield or forgetting your gloves.
Exactly, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to figure those things out, because it compromises the mission, be it
team.
a military mission or a hunt, or even the job you just described. You have to figure out a lot of things. There's weapons. So won't get into a lot of detail, but like weapons in the cold, automatic weapons, semi-automatic weapons, there's a lot of limitations to that weapon system in the cold, depending on how you treat it, how it's maintained, all those things. It's not just a given. It's not the same thing.
You get a little bit of water inside a mechanism with some springs and some slides, and the next thing you know, that sumbitch is froze solid.
Exactly. Or if you, even bringing it inside of a shelter that it's been outside, just that little bit of body heat inside that shelter will make that weapon sweat. And then when you bring it back outside, then it freezes and the bolt's locked and nothing will, work. Then you get to the battery. So I was helping a guy 2 weeks ago. I did another overnight camp for another guy just to film some stuff for him. And his video guy was like, hey, what do we do? And I'm like, oh, you guys don't know about this. I'm like, yeah, this is a thing. Like batteries and coal don't work. And so, I don't know about the new technology, but like lithiums are better than alkalines. But nonetheless, the batteries that went in our radios, like you had to sleep with them in your sleeping bag. You had a bunch of extra radios. We would literally sometimes put them in like a little kid's insulated lunchbox with like hot hands and things like that. But you have to do something and constantly think about that. So you're battling the element, right? You're guaranteed you're battling the elements. Even if you never, battle anybody else.
Yeah.
You still have to figure all that out. And nothing's given out there.
Even when I'm out hunting, I keep my cell phone inside my coat pocket.
My cell phone died last week, just like you described. I'm like, and I thought it was insulated, but clearly it was in a pocket that wasn't as insulated. It was like 1% battery life. Well, that phone is what I use with the inReach to communicate because we didn't have cell service. And I'm like, I got to figure that. Now, I had a way to charge it, but I'm like, I know if I just put this a couple layers deeper near my body, it's going to warm up. Boom, it was like back to 90% in, an hour.
Yeah.
But all those little lessons that you have to learn. And sometimes even my first time out in the winter every year, some of them I have to like relearn. Yeah. Like, oh yeah, that's right. I got to do this. I got to do that. Can't leave water out, whatever it is. But you have to figure all those things out in that really cold environment. And it's not something that a lot of us, we don't live in it year round here. I mean, it seems like it this winter, but it's only going to be 4 months.
We do live in it, but we really don't live in it at all.
No.
Like when you think about it, it's you and I were discussing last night some like being preparedness, having, I was telling you I would like to set up a generator, but I feel like I'm more prepared than a lot of people because I have a wood stove and I purposely bought a gas range for my kitchen so I can still cook without power. I have some lanterns. We had to use them the other night just because we lost power for 4 or 5 hours. 2 weeks in a row, we used our lanterns. But I told you I did have some kerosene. The kerosene that I was actually using to dunk my billets of Damascus in that bucket.
Yeah.
I was pouring some of that out into our lanterns, but I didn't have any wicks.
Yeah.
So I told my wife, like, we need to get some wicks. And again, like I mentioned to you, I'm really not a crazy prepper. Like I don't necessarily think anytime real soon that we're going to be out of power for a long, long time. But also when you look at what's going on in the world, it could be next week that like shit completely hits the fan.
Hey man, we live in Montana.
Yeah.
Okay. And we just had a giant Chinese spy balloon fly and linger over our state a couple weeks ago.
No shit. And we have.
I mean, what the fuck? If you'd if our buddy Jack would have written that into a book,
yes,
they'd have tossed it out as craziness.
Right.
Right. Like, oh, that's not believable.
Well, and even you as a former, as a veteran, you'd be like, Jack, a balloon.
Yeah, I know,
you
right?
couldn't have flown something cooler over
in 2023, a balloon.
The U.S. to spy on us. You flew a balloon, a hot air balloon. Basically, it's true. But we have the most. I think we have the most. I don't know about the most. We have a shit ton of nukes.
Yes,
in the ground. Where I was telling you where I used to run my. Well, you weren't here last night, but I was telling these guys where we used to chase coyotes and run around my buddy's ranch. Like we drove around those sites. I mean, they grow grain right around those sites, and they have their cattle pastures and shit. Yeah. We have all kinds of nukes spread out all over around Augusta and Wolf
so
Creek.
we think we're kind of out of it in the middle of nowhere. It's like, no, man, like it literally just happened. Yeah. And so, prepping is unfortunately gotten the negative connotation of paranoia.
From the year 2000.
Yeah, so I don't like the term,
a prepper.
But I would tell you being prepared is not being paranoid.
Yeah.
And I think they're two different things, right? So, there's no way to have 100 years worth of or 10 years worth of food and water stored up in gasoline. Like, I mean, I'm sure you could, but it's like just thinking through some things.
We've lived through some things here just recently. COVID. Yes. Like being prepared or, being a prepper for, nuclear war with China. Like, I don't know if that's ever going to happen. I mean, it's probably going to happen, but it could be 3 more generations, like, I don't know.
But you could run out of toilet paper tomorrow.
Yeah.
Or eggs.
But
or, you know.
But another virus, all we are mammals, and quite frankly, we're becoming an overpopulated mammal in a lot of places.
Yeah.
You know, storms, winter storms, as a lineman, I worked on storms where I saw when we were one power line away from having a real problem. And I also saw what some of the trailers in Missoula that were out of power when we had troubles going on with storms that were out of power for a day. Like, how big of a bind these people were in 24 hours.
Yeah.
A lot of these, you know, mobile parks and stuff, and even the new house construction, there were people's like really nice brand new homes getting really cold in 24 hours.
Yeah.
Well, what happens if that's a week or 3 weeks or a month?
Yep.
You know?
Yeah, and so you think about it, you're like, well, I got nothing to learn from this guy. Like, you know, he taught this super high-level elite military, blah, 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 and all this. It's like, no, man, like, people were dying in their cars in Buffalo, New York this winter, driving home because they ran out of gas or got stuck in a snowbank, and they literally froze to death because they weren't either prepared or didn't understand how to stay warm. And, you know, I talked about that. And, you know, Mike and Kevin at Fieldcraft, like, they do a really good job. And you're like, yeah, those things that we used to teach to the highest levels of the military, those basic principles can be applied to keep you safe, warm, you know, at least functioning in your home through a natural disaster or just, you know, a power outage or, you know, God forbid, another pandemic or whatever the case may be.
A car accident. I mean, and forever, you know, growing up in Lincoln, we always got our groceries in like Helena, Great Falls, or Missoula. That's always, went to town for like the big stuff, right? You go to, back then it wasn't Costco, but say now Costco. Well, especially back then, Lincoln had no cell phone coverage. But for sure, between Missoula and Lincoln and Great Falls and a lot of these places, there's no cell phone coverage. You know, you slide off the road on Rogers Pass and you go off the wrong spot where no one sees you, you might have to survive the night. And we always, in all of our vehicles, had, you know, wool blanket or a couple sleeping bags and gloves and, you know, flares. And even my mom would keep snacks in there. And it was only for an hour and a half trip.
Yeah.
You know, so to your point with the storms going on, you know, back east, to have a little bit of preparedness in the trunk of your car, the Fieldcraft Survival, like medical kits, you know, when I saw Tier with Black Rifle teach a tourniquet class, and it really resonated when he's like, so if you don't have this $30 tourniquet and you get in a car accident that might even be somewhat minor, but a piece of glass, you know, cuts an artery on your child, and all you would have needed was a $30 tourniquet with the training that you've just got in the last 30 minutes. Your child dies, like, can you live with yourself?
Yeah, wouldn't you feel like a fool?
Yeah, and you know, or maybe you come up on a car accident, and it's like, hey, I have a basic level of medical, you know, kit here in my car that you can hand a, you know, maybe someone who's even more prepared than or trained than yourself to help. This preparedness stuff it's not a prepper situation. You know, I always think of the prepper thing from the year 2000 when the clocks were going to change over.
Yeah.
That's, I think, really got the worst because, like, we actually dug a basement, and we know a guy that we watched it all happen. They built this concrete, like, vault to live in. Like, they were moving into it underground. They were sure that through the end of the world. Like, that's a crazy person, you know?
Yeah.
But from then on, like, we've lived enough life here lately to see enough things happen to understand that, like, man, if shit really hit the fan where a guy like Andy Stump or Mike Glover or you somewhat panic and, like, this is bad. You call your wife and you're like, this is bad. If you guys are worried and scared, imagine what people that have no training, no ability, like, look at what happened to the shelves during COVID.
Right, yeah.
It's insane. To be able to survive and have a little bit of food or some basic, you know, survival skills is absolutely critical.
Yeah, I don't want to have to rely on anyone, if possible, for a short period of time. Like I said, at some point, like, the community has to come together, right?
Yes.
But I want to be self-reliant. I want to be capable and competent, and no matter what I do.
Yeah.
And I just think that that's not paranoid to think that way. That's just realistic. And I think multiple times in the last several years have proven itself out to be, man, we're like living a bad Hollywood movie right now.
Yeah.
Like some of the things that are going on, pandemics and spy balloons, and I mean, nobody would have believed it a decade ago.
The president of the United States landed on the ground in a war zone in an airplane. Like, it boggles my mind that Biden landed in Ukraine in the middle of a war, and you tell me we're not trying to pick a fight. Like, mind-boggling to me.
Yeah.
You know, that there's clearly, you know, I was talking to Tim Kennedy, like, it clearly appears that we are trying to be in a conflict with China or Russia or both. You know, it's unbelievable. It's scary.
Looks like it to me.
But back to your career
Okay,
path.
so that was a
we'll get
that
off.
was a deep rabbit hole.
Yeah, we could go way farther down that rabbit hole. But you're with Sitka now. You came out of the military. You're with Sitka, and it's cool to me that a company like Sitka saw the benefit, the value of having somebody like yourself, you know, on board and that could help their brand. How did that happen?
Well, honestly, a lot of us need somebody to give us a break or a first chance when we come out of the military. Some people know what they want to do. Some people don't. Some people got an MBA, whatever. I wasn't one of them. I will give credit to two people, though, outside of my charm and good looks. Jack Carr and Jonathan Hart. So Jack Carr, as people know, is this best-selling author, right? Well, Jack and I worked together for 20 years on and off. Matter of fact, before I retired, I was basically, there's different, but I was like a training officer, and Jack was the operations officer that I basically worked with, right? And then so I retire, and then Jack ends up retiring maybe a year or two later. But I told you, I remember him and Andy walking into the team like back as new guys in '97.
Yeah.
So we had this long storied history, and you just build trust with people. Well, I wanted to get this job with Sitka. I had no idea I was trying to take the job from essentially the founder. I was going to be the first person to hold the job. It was going to be the biggest foundational part of the company, the big game side of the house, you know. I'm just a jackass. Like, what do I know? And so they weren't really sure on me. And it was 11 months of them looking for somebody to take this job. And then Jack and Jonathan are riding a chairlift at Tahoe, clearly fucking off.
Yeah.
And Jack says, "Hey, have you ever found anybody to fill that job there at Sitka, blah, blah?" And he's like, "Nah, haven't found anybody yet." And Jack's like, "Well, you know, you should give this guy, John Barklow, at least a call. I think he applied." And Hart's like, "How do you know him?" And so they get into it. And just that conversation, Jonathan called me personally, had a conversation on the phone, hit it off, and he's like, "Hey, man, I want you to at least come in and interview. No guarantees, just come in and interview face-to-face." Boom, got the job.
Yeah.
So I don't think I knew what I was getting into. I don't think they knew what they were getting into. Listen, I've learned a lot. I didn't know anything about business. Now I know at least a little bit about business.
Yeah.
But I think it's also what has helped propel and excel and place Sitka where it is. Because, listen, fuck you. You want to come and question me, what I'm doing, and think you're doing it better or you know more? It's like, I'm not saying you don't know as much, but like any brand X, Y, Z, like, let's have a conversation. But like, I've been there, I've done that, I've got the track record. I don't have the business acumen, but as far as the gear and what we've done and how we've placed it and what we test and what we're putting out there and stand behind, like, there is nothing that's been done like that before. But that's all because they gave a guy like me a chance. Yeah. And I'll always be, indebted to them for that. And then it was up to me to either screw it up or figure it out, Yeah. But sometimes it's that network, and it's who you know, and it's how you work that network. And honestly, sometimes you just got to get a little lucky too. Yeah. Well,
I mean, nobody's more of a benefit of some good luck than I am with like the network. You've
done an excellent job.
We started the conversation off with the people that were around this weekend and the people that have helped us. And
there you go. Yeah.
Yeah, it's huge. But we've seen Sitka gear has become the brand, really, in the apparel world, in the hunting apparel gear world. Like, it's the powerhouse in the brand. I don't think there's anybody close, as far as just on scale, the size, the amount of different options of apparel out there, but the quality of it, and a ton of that was designed really and thought up through by you.
Yeah.
Right. How does that process work when you come up with an idea? I mean, I imagine you probably have a sewing machine in your kitchen and you're in there sewing stuff. And
I don't sew. I'm known for my stick figures and my line drawings, right? Which is kind of a joke, but I really do that. But no, I work with a guy specifically that is the truly talented guy. So I have the idea, I have the concept. I talk to him about it. He and I work on that first prototype. There's another gentleman in town there that we've contracted out, world-class guy. We can build anything from a concept to a proto in a week if we need to. Like we could build a Gore-Tex jacket that nobody would know it didn't come from a factory if we want to, just to test a concept. And then from there, so this is where the business side comes in. It's like, okay, we know it works. Here's how we're going to market it. Like here's a problem it's trying to solve. That's where we always start. Then slowly the business side comes in. I've said this years ago, but we've come up with ideas, concepts, built a product that quite frankly the world's not ready for. And what I mean by that is the technology is either so far advanced and costs so much money, or it's going to take so much to educate the consumer how to use it and like leverage it that it's just the market's just not ready for it yet.
Right.
It's like giving your son Hank there the keys to your Porsche, right? The day he turns 16, he doesn't even know how to drive the car, let alone run through the gears. He grinds it in a third, goes 60 miles an hour, says this is awesome, right? You're like, okay, Junior, move over, let me get in. You run it up to 6th gear, go 120 miles an hour. He's like, holy shit, like I never knew something like this even existed. That's what we're trying to do. That is what we're trying to do. I am personally always trying to push the envelope, educate. I love educating, love teaching, help people out, right? That's what we're trying to do is truly build these clothing systems that are going to save people's lives. Hopefully it never gets to that. Hopefully it just goes, hey, I can go duck hunt on a really, really shitty day and have an awesome time.
Right.
And if that's as far as it's pushed, that's perfect. That's what we want to do. That's what we're trying to solve for.
Well, and you guys are, being able to increase people's odds of actually taking an elk down or shooting ducks or whatever, to be able to be out when it's raining, snowing, cold, miserable. Like the more days you can spend in the field, behind glass, scouting, doing whatever you're doing, a guy like Cole Kramer that, may have to glass for bears in piss pouring rain and terrible conditions for 7 days straight before they finally find a bear.
Some of the worst weather on earth is where him and Trevor and those guys guide and are super successful consistently in some horrible weather, right? You can't do that like without that protection from the elements. And like what I tell people is, we all want to get in the gym and train. We all want to go shoot our weapons, right? We all want to go do all that fun stuff. We want to go hike with the pack and all that kind of stuff. We want to learn how to call, be it a duck or an elk or whatever. But ultimately, if you can't go out there, live, thrive, survive,
right,
and stay in the field through some really inclement weather potentially, you're never going to give yourself the best odds of success, right? Sometimes you get really good animal movement on the tail end of a storm. And I just had a guy tell me the last 2 years, like in Colorado, he went out and him and his buddy were able to weather this storm where everybody else left the mountain. And as that storm petered out, the elk moved and they both killed bulls the last 2 years. But you got to keep yourself out there, and you have to keep yourself, in the game, mentally, physically, emotionally. Like you have to be able to do that. And if you're just fighting for survival, you're like, I'm pulling the pin, I'm leaving.
It is supposed to be fun.
It is. It might be type 2 fun sometimes, but that's what it's all about.
Yeah.
So it's like the more odds you can stack in your favor, because they're already against you, the better off I think you'll be over time.
Sure.
Yeah.
In regards to all this, with what you're doing with Sitka, you've developed this like training and teaching piece in the last few years. Like it was interesting. In the beginning, it seemed like it started off with a couple Instagram videos and just of you kind of teaching some stuff, and then it's really becoming more and more formalized with all this experience. It seems like you're really putting an effort into putting out this information, I've shared it a couple times where I'm like, people, I don't know if you understand what this is like or how incredible this information is, but you guys need to pay attention. Like you need to watch this. And I go back and I've done this a few times. I did it last year right before season where I go back and I'll find some of your videos and I'll watch them then, like when I'm trying to prepare my pack or get ready for something. It's an incredible resource what you're doing, and I'm excited because it seems like lately you've been really ramping that up more and more.
Yeah.
And you said, like, clearly you love to teach. I mean, it's what you did as a career, really.
Yeah.
I mean, past the Navy diving.
Yep.
At that point, obviously there's something about that you love.
Yeah, I didn't know it at the time, but yeah, I think that to be true. So anymore, it's difficult to separate me. And listen, I don't think anybody set out for this to be the case, but it's a little hard to separate me right now from Sitka and then what I'm doing, say, on my own, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because to me, the lines just blur. Like my buddy, he came out last year to hunt, and I take the week off for hunting, and I think it was antelope hunting, so I got service and this and that. And he's like, you never stop working. And I was like, I guess that's true, but really in some regard, like, I almost feel sometimes like I never start working because, like, it's all the same to me. Like, work and, like, my off time and, like, what I'm thinking about, like, it's just all one thing, But when COVID started, the challenge to me was, okay, you could get fat and lazy or you could do something. Mm-hmm. Nobody knew how long it was going to last. I assumed it would last 3 months, 3 months. So I quit drinking and I said, I want to come out of COVID better than I went into it. Like I said, I didn't think it'd last longer than 3 months. And so I'm just working from the house and I've got more time than ever because I'm not spending an hour driving and all this kind of stuff. And so I realized, I'd been thinking about it for a long time, but I realized that I missed teaching and that I felt like I was really being selfish because I thought I had some information that was maybe a little bit unique, or the way I present it was just a little bit unique, and that I was being selfish by at least not sharing that with a community of people that I really liked, right? And I wanted to be a part of, and I was becoming a part of through Sitka. And so I started my own business, and that business was essentially online education. I hijacked, as my buddy said, Instagram to do some of that. I've taught SAR courses to different groups and things like that, outdoor class and things like that have started. But it was just a way of giving back. And one, satiating me that I was at least teaching. Two, that I was helping people. And three, that I was not being selfish, right? Just give the information away. And, if people don't like it, I'm not going to argue with you. Like, that's fine. We all have different opinions. And I have, 6 ways of doing everything. So if you want to do it a different way, we can discuss that. But so that's been, I don't know, man, like, I think coming up on 3 years now, insanely enough. And the more I do it, listen, I like to tell you that I'm somewhat of a unwilling participant in this, right? I don't necessarily like being on camera. I don't necessarily like having somebody follow you around and this and that. But I also see the value and that people really appreciate it and like it's helping people. So, you kind of got to get over yourself sometimes. But look what it's, look who's allowed it to, the group of people to come together, like we said, just like over the weekend. So I've really enjoyed it. I am trying to ramp it up. I don't know if people remember, but at least I told myself, if I didn't say this publicly, but I told myself every year. So first of all, because it's mine, I reserve the right to stop it at any second.
Yeah.
If I don't like it, if I don't feel the need anymore, I'm just going to quit and walk away and nobody will ever hear from me again. But if I keep doing it every year, I want to try to do it better and better. Mm-hmm. So, it went from just me and my phone, and then I built a little studio, and now I got, a guy helping me film and edit, and then, I got the outdoor class, and I just want to see where it goes, and maybe it goes nowhere, but right now, I don't even think we collectively, as this small community of people that we were just together with, we haven't even begun to tap into satiating the appetite for people with interest, right? Yeah. And a genuine somewhat need for some of this stuff. So I've really enjoyed the hell out of it. Yeah.
Yeah. The thing that strikes me the most about what I think people, well, I don't know. I haven't talked to a lot of people about your particular content, but what I love about it, what strikes me so is so genuine is that you really could have come at all of this content way more in a marketing way, right? Like pushing Sitka gear, right? Or even pushing another product or something that that you would have wanted to have maybe pushed and try to make some money off of or whatever. And the videos I watch, you're not like up there saying, well, at Sitka Gear we have this and we have that and whatever. It's entirely, you know, now obviously occasionally there's a piece of Sitka Gear that you work in, or you might talk about a certain piece because it's the piece you need for, it's the tool for the job.
Yeah.
That you're talking about.
Yeah, that's fair.
But none of it comes across at all in a marketing ploy, like, oh, this guy's just teaching because he's trying to move more gear or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And not that there would be anything wrong with that. I mean, you know, I compare it kind of somewhat to some of the stuff that Dudley does with the archery stuff, right? Like, it's going to naturally lead to some sales for his business. But just because it might lead to some sales also doesn't mean that it's not incredibly valuable information.
Right.
That even if you don't buy his particular release or his particular, you know, bow setup or whatever, it's still very valuable information that you can even use with your existing equipment that you have, or like in your case, you know, another piece of clothing from another company.
Right. Yeah.
And I look at it also like, you know, with Maddie Nelson out here yesterday from Sitka Precision, right? Like, I have one of their ARs that they built me. But I am not knowledgeable and don't have the understanding and haven't taken the time to learn how to properly use that tool to its, not even to its fullest extent. I'm never going to get to that point, but just to use that tool effectively.
Mm-hmm.
And I look at gear, like say Sitka gear, right? And I am again, this is where I think what you're talking about and what you're doing is so critical. Is I have more experience and knowledge than a lot of people when it comes to using like Sitka gear and the clothing layer system, because there's a lot of people out there that know nothing, and they haven't had to learn it because they might be tree stand hunting in Arkansas, and you know, like they don't need to have the need to know the layering systems in the cold. But with what I do know, it's far from where I want to be. And it's why I find myself pulling your videos up and trying to fully understand. And I feel like I have a responsibility and a duty. And sometimes I almost feel like I'm a bit reckless a little bit or being irresponsible, because I'm also taking my children out in the field. And like, who gives a shit about myself? But I for sure don't want to get my kids in a bind where we find ourselves lost in a storm, or a child of mine's fallen in a creek or something like that and wet, and I don't know what to do.
Right.
Or how to, or I didn't bring the right gear to properly rectify that situation. So with what you're doing, it's just so informational and so incredible. Like, I have most all of the pieces of the gear that you need to do it right, but I think I find myself probably not taking all the pieces or the pieces I should be in the right situations. And I think that's the key. I think a lot of people have the gear that you guys sell at Sitka, but they don't necessarily have the knowledge to apply to use it properly.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you, because that's a great compliment to say it's not, you know, a marketing message, because it's not, right? But also to go back to capable and competent. That's what I want to be. That's what I want everybody to be in whatever they want to do. But if they want to go outdoors, I think I can help them be capable and competent. Now, you know, I'm never going to run a gun like Matty does either, because that's what he does, right?
Right.
I don't expect somebody to be able to do what I did for 20-some years at a very high professional level with literally almost no barrier to get gear and instruction. But that's where a guy like Matty or myself is like, but we can give back and we can make people capable and competent, right?
Yeah.
And so with me and my message, and, you know, I know people joke about it, and it's totally cool, because I do too. But like, when I go into instructor mode, which is to teach, you know, either an IG video or whatever, or in front of people, like, I get kind of serious. And I joke around a lot when I teach, like in person, like a lot. But at the end of the day, that shit could save your life.
Yeah.
And so if you want to listen, like, I think I have something to help you with.
Yeah.
But I purposely, very prescriptively went out of my way to not make it all about one brand or one product or one technique or way of doing something. Because from what I've seen, and, you know, I don't know the knife world, but my guess is there's a lot of ways to make knives. Now, there may be one recognized way to make the best Damascus steel, right? But there's probably a lot of ways to make knives. And so it's like, hey, man, I really don't care what gear or brand you affiliate or gear you have or gear you like or gear you got from a buddy or a discount or something like this, or, you know, how you want to make a fire or what knife you use. I can teach you to use any of it to become capable and competent to the maximum that product or technique will allow. I can help you maximize that. Why? Because I've taught it for so long. I'm not saying I know everything, but I've seen a lot. And when you're teaching and trying to be as effective as you can't just teach somebody this way is the only way.
Right.
It's like, this is the way I prefer, and maybe here's why, but there's a bunch of other ways. And so people will reach out, they're like, hey man, like, you know, I only got this much money and I want to buy some Sitka gear. Where do I start? Okay, what are you doing? Where are you going to do it? Do you have a base layer? So base layer underwear. They're like, yeah, but it's some other brand. I'm like, Roger that. You know what? That brand, that base layer is totally fine. Do not throw that away.
Right.
Maybe buy yourself a pair of pants. Maybe buy yourself a jacket. Maybe you got a puffy jacket. Maybe invest in the puffy jacket first. If you want to come back and buy base layers later, you can. But you will still be able to build a complete system that will give you more capability than you have now. Mm-hmm. And so I think when you hear people say that, you're like, I hope people say, that person actually knows what he's talking about, because it's not just this very prescriptive thing and nothing else.
Right.
When I put a gear list out, I'm going to tell you exactly what I use. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean you have to use it, but that's what I'm using. There's a lot of why behind that. We can talk through it. But when people sit there and say, well, I only use this or I only use that, I get really upset with some people in the industry who do that, because I'm like, you're not helping those people. So as an example, it's like, I only take a TP tent, or I only take a tarp. And it's like, yeah, bro, but without the why, you're like, maybe you don't go to Kodiak, Alaska. Maybe you only live in the desert Southwest. Right. Maybe you have 30 years of experience doing this thing, right? That you can do that. But like, for somebody starting out who has no idea, and they're like, oh, well, so-and-so said, no, I'm just going to take you're setting them up for failure.
Right.
Failure just in the trip at a minimum. Hopefully you don't hurt them, you know? And so it's like, I think we as a community just need to be more open and say, stop trying to sell somebody something all the time.
Right. And
just try to help them and be their mentor, maybe, to make them more capable and competent.
Right.
And everything else will sort itself out. You know, you'll buy my gear. Hopefully you buy my gear more than somebody else's because you trust me. But it's like, but if you go buy somebody else's because that's what you like or that's what you can afford, I'm okay with that too, as long as you understand how to use it.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a guy like Aaron Snyder who, you know, has Kafaro, and I've seen him out, you know, using Sitka gear. And, you know, I see guys with some of these different brands, and at times they're wearing a different piece of gear because that other company makes a good piece of gear. It's not.
There's a lot of good gear out there right now.
Yeah, and it's yeah, it's just, I just think this knowledge and this teaching that you're doing is so critically important, and I see it because I also think there's a lot of people doing similar kind of stuff out there that don't have the knowledge base, and they are doing it for the marketing piece of it.
That unfortunately is true.
And that's the part where now, okay, no, well, man, you kind of have a huge responsibility if you're putting content out there, especially if you're not giving the full story or putting the wrong kind of content out for the dollar, that you can potentially have a guy and his son in a bad situation in the cold somewhere in Montana that drove out here from Texas and went off into the Bob Marshall Wilderness in September and left the truck when it was 70. And the next thing you know, 3 days later, they woke up to 8 inches of snow on their tent, and they're in fucking trouble.
Yeah, real trouble. I mean, it happened this last, the opening weekend of rifle season last year. Was that like the 21st of October-ish, somewhere in there? And it was, I don't know about where you guys were, but you know, it was predicted. It was calling. I even did a little video just warning people.
You did. I remember you put that
It was
out.
raining in the valley, and it was dumping at 9,000 feet. And sure enough, I think just around Bozeman alone, SAR had to go out and rescue 4 groups of people.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like, man, like self-inflicted. Listen, it can happen to anybody. It can even happen to me, right? But it's like you want to stack the odds as much in your favor as possible so that it doesn't happen. And the more people that are getting into hunting and just the outdoors, and obviously a lot through COVID, and people are starting to travel more, and people from east want to come west. And listen, you can get in trouble just as bad back east. It just doesn't happen as often, right? The distances, the remoteness isn't quite as much, but it can certainly happen. Yeah. And at a minimum, not to digress, but you know, you want to kill a big buck and give yourself the best chance in Pennsylvania or Kansas, like you better be able to sit there all day, right? Day after day after day. But the more people that do that, the more the odds go up that more of these things are going to happen. And so it's like, we almost have an obligation to give back. And like, dude, when I was a kid growing up in Ohio, so I was a self-taught archery whitetail deer hunter on public land. Like, I was an absolute failure. Like, never killed a deer, right? Definitely terrorized the squirrels and chipmunks. Never killed a deer. Got lost. Carried too much shit. You know, used to figure out how to land that by reading a book. Absolutely the most cherished outdoor memories I've got in my life.
Yeah.
Right? But I wished I'd have had somebody at the time
yeah,
to help me at least. I like to say, I can't climb the ladder for you. I can't climb the mountain, but I can help lessen the steepness of the learning curve.
Yeah.
Right? And there's a lot of us out there that can. How cool is that to be able to do that? Like, that's a pretty cool thing to be able to say, you know, you're doing.
Well, you and I, you know, you're a little bit older than me, but we grew up in the same time, same situation. My dad didn't hunt. I learned from people in town. So I didn't have anybody really, and I mean, I don't even remember them telling me, like, it basically was like, oh, hey, I'll pick you up at 6 a.m. at your folks' house, but just have some warm clothes on, you know.
Yeah, that's about the extent of it back
was like,
then.
which warm clothes to me was like my Carhartt jacket, like my heavier Carhartt that I had for like working with my dad outside, right? You know, and I remember actually being like a junior in high school, and I finally had enough money. I bought some woolies, you know, to wear some wool in rifle season. But with where was I going with that? I was going to talk about shit. I lost my train of thought.
People coming east to west, and
yeah, damn it. I had a good one.
Well, I'll just tell you why you think about it, because you know, you bring up a point. So same thing with me. I still have my one-piece duck hunter camo, you know, like maybe insulated one piecer that I used to whitetail deer hunt in the late season. But you know, a lot of this stuff, system layering, all this, none of it existed, right? And people were trying to, you know, at the time push a little bit. But you know, I hear people all the time say, well, you know, my dad, my granddad, you know, my brother, whatever, like we used to go out and, you know, wear the Carhartt and wear the jeans and all that. And I'm like, absolutely. First of all, they were tougher than us. Second of all, they didn't know any better. Third, if you'd offered them what we got now, hell yeah, they'd have taken it. Fourth, there was a lot more game out there and a lot less people. So you often didn't have to spend as much time to find an animal to harvest it, right? Yeah. But also, my bet was a lot of them got pushed out of the mountains prematurely.
For sure.
Because they had to. Like, at the end of the day, cotton's cotton, right? Tough is tough. But nowadays, you can spend more time out there. You can be more comfortable. Nobody likes to be cold and wet on purpose, right? So, and you need that extra time now to stack the odds as much in your favor as possible to try to find that success.
And all the hunting we were doing back then, it was, you know, parking the truck at 6 a.m, hunting for a while, and back to the truck by like 1. Mm-hmm. You know, unless you got on a track or some shit happened. But like you weren't having to survive in the woods for a few days. You know, we were never taking tents and whatnot. But I remember what I was getting at with you and I growing up in that time frame, with no availability for information like now with YouTube videos and the internet and all that. Everything I was reading about how to do stuff was essentially magazine articles in like a Field and Stream.
Absolutely.
And let's face it, a lot of that stuff is marketing stuff.
Yeah.
Right? And so you don't know back then you thought what you were getting, if you read it in Field and Stream, it was gospel.
It was the Bible.
And what you kind of realize, especially when we've both live in this world now, that like quite a bit of the stuff that's written is driven by advertising dollars and, you know, who's paying for ads and who's paying for this and that. And there's definitely good writers out there and there's people writing some good articles. But like you start to realize that not everything you're reading in these magazines is actually the best piece of information. And also they only have so much room in an article. So they're leaving so much key information out. Like your ability in a video to deep dive, you know, is incredible. Like you can go as deep as you want.
And I'm just scratching the surface, to be quite honest.
Yeah.
I mean, for most of it. Really, the ultimate is education in some type of class setting, followed by, you know, a day or two or three or whatever, depending on the subject matter, of like actual lab. Right. So that applying that knowledge and then learning, right? Which a lot of that, I mean, some of it exists, but not really to the levels that maybe you and I would like it to exist. But,
sure.
Yeah, and listen, maybe I've probably I don't know, I might have put myself at some disadvantage by you know, not being a marketer and not trying to be, you know, so over the top, but like I'm all about the information, and I always figure the rest of it will sort itself out from there.
I do know, we've talked about this a little bit, and I know a couple of my friends and I have talked, you know, your friends have talked about like, man, like John could capitalize on some of this stuff so much more, because there definitely is like a lot of marketing opportunity in what you're doing. But that's the part that's like, not that you shouldn't do maybe a little bit more of that here and there where it fits, makes sense to. But again, that's the respect for what you're doing, that it's so real and so not driven by anything that's selfish or you know, you're not trying to gain from it. You're truly just sharing information. And honestly, you know, I used to put on conferences here, hammer-ins, and people would pay to come here to learn from other knife makers that I would bring in. And occasionally I'd have guys, you know, like, well, you know, $225 for 3 days. It's kind of expensive. You know, there's another hammer-in down in Arkansas that's $50. And it's like, dude, I'm bringing in 8 of the best knife makers in the world.
Yeah.
They all have put 20 to 30, maybe 40 years a piece into honing their craft. And they're going to tell you all the like high points of everything they've learned over the last 40 years to advance your knife making career in 3 days, a decade. And you don't want to pay them $225.
I just say, what's it worth to you? And you know what? It might not be worth it to that person.
Right.
But it will be worth it to somebody else. And, you know, listen, over time, I'm going to continue to scale this. Like, I'm not a complete knucklehead,
right?
You know? But at the end of the day, like, people that want to learn will sign up and learn. And there is more opportunity now from, you know, it's not just military guys, but if you want to learn how to, tactically shoot a carbine or a long range rifle or a pistol or learn how to survive, right?
Right.
Dude, there has never been as much world-class knowledge available for anybody to come off the street and like learn from some of the best. It's like at an all-time high.
I say people bitch about social media, and there is the bad part of it, but like between social media, YouTube, that stuff, there's never been a time where there's been more available information. Like, it can be the most powerful and informational tool. It can change your life. I mean, it's how we built a business, frankly. I mean, we built it off of that. It's a free marketing tool on the marketing side, and it's a free educational tool on the other side. It's absolutely incredible. It's and I think, you know, when it comes to like paying for a class from a guy like you, or paying to go and maybe listen to you talk, or for a video, are you charging for any of your videos yet? Do you have a paid platform yet?
So I just built my first course with Outdoor Class. Mm-hmm. So Outdoor Class is a combination of Go Hunt and Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation got together. Their vision was to create this online educational platform for outdoors people. So not just hunting, right? Like, I've seen the kind of the grand vision.
Yeah.
So it's called Outdoor Class. It's basically master class for the outdoors. I just built my first 16 chapter course with them. I got 2 more I'm going to build over the next 2 years. And it's called Backcountry Mission Planning, right? I don't know personally, I'm not tooting my own horn, but maybe the course is, I don't know anywhere that level of information, some of which people probably, just talking to people, have never even considered, is in one particular class. And so, for a yearly membership, you can sign up and get access to every single course on outdoor class, and that will continue to scale over the years. That was really my first kind of foray into that. I would like to get into providing in-person courses. Yeah. I just have to figure out how to fit it into my schedule around my full-time job right now.
Well, the reason I asked that is if you picture yourself being in the mountains, cold and wet, and with some really shitty gear in your pack and trying to figure out how to get dry. Like, at that moment in time, would you pay $200 for the answer?
At that point, money's not even an option.
So to me, I also look at it like the amount of money that people have invested in their gear, including Sitka gear, a knife, a long-range hunting rifle with optics and spotting scope, and like all this shit they're carrying. Half the time you see a guy carrying a big-ass spotting scope and he's hunting in the timber of western Montana. It's like, bro, kick that out and maybe carry a puffy and, a shelter, a tarp. The amount of money they spend all that, God, why not spend another $100 to take a class from somebody? And maybe it's a shooting class or whatever, any kind of a class.
All these things are investments. You're making that investment. What people, one, because it hasn't been offered until very recently, but what they haven't been able to make the investment in is the actual training now. Mm-hmm. So I'm a huge proponent of training, right? Like, everything's about the training and preparation, so to speak. Even with your clothing, even with your food, like whatever it is. A lot of times we just focus on the weapon system because it's fun, right? Or in the gym, like I said earlier. But you're making these huge investments, and it's like you kind of want to get the most bang for your buck, right? And there's not a lot of, you mentioned Aaron, there's me. I don't really know of a lot of other people in our world who, quite frankly, have the knowledge or the interest to pass on that information, right? So there are a few people, but there's not a lot. But to me, it's invaluable because if you can go out there and spend time and not suffer, which you don't have to suffer. There's various levels of suffering, but and give yourself the best chance of using that $10,000 rifle, like, why would you not do that?
Yeah. Hank and I have talked a little bit about, and I'm going to say this, but I need to put it into action just as much as anybody. Him and I have talked about getting our packs all together and stuff, and just going right out back here, and maybe the next time that a big storm's coming in and it's going to be 0, and just setting up and sleeping in it, right? And getting a fire going. Maybe after we go out there and maybe get kind of cold before we agree to
it drives urgency.
Right. Yeah. And that's the one thing I was going to say is that, and I've heard you say it, you can practice this stuff when it's not hunting season, and it's really the best time, because if Hank and I really screw it up, we can walk to the house,
right,
get warm, regroup, and try to get another time.
You don't want to do that on an elk hunt. You don't want to do that when you've invested all this time, traveling out of state and burning gas money and time away from family and vacation days and got this great tag in your pocket or whatever it is. And then that happens and you're like, yeah, I got to go home.
Yeah.
Or I didn't understand altitude and its effects on me, right? Yeah. But hunting season is such a short moment in time. But if we like being out there, it's like, what are you doing the other, say, 9-10 months out of the year? It's like, man, that's when you can go and backpack to the high lake and go fish,
take pictures,
but also train with your gear. Also understand its limitations and what works for you. And and that's when you're like, okay, well, I screwed up. And listen, I screw up a lot, definitely in the past. I'm like, but I can go home now because I got really nothing invested in this.
Right.
And that's how you learn and build that experience. And then when you are out there and that snowstorm comes in and you guys are on a big bull, you're like, well, you know what? We know we can get in the tent, stay warm, weather it out. When this storm passes, we're going to take that opportunity.
Yep.
And that's what it's all about.
Yeah. Well, cool, man. What knowledge from storms?
Yeah, that's right. Website, YouTube channel. Yep.
knowledgefromstorms.com.
Yes.
Yeah. What's your Instagram?
At @Barklow.
Okay. Yeah, I highly encourage people to go follow what you're doing. I think it's super cool. I sit there, part of probably why I'm so invested in it too is, one, you're a friend, but also I didn't know, and I'm kind of frankly was embarrassed when you say, like I wasn't a Navy SEAL, like, because I knew you were in the Navy and I knew you trained.
It happens.
Did all this, but
it's because I'm good looking and I got a watch on.
But it's also a compliment, honestly, and a testament to how respected you are in that community and how respected the knowledge is that you have. Because I've talked to Andy Stumpf, I've talked to Jack Carr, Trevor Thompson, these guys, and that community absolutely adores you. I mean, they love you like a brother, and I can guarantee Andy Stumpf would be the first one to say, I served with a lot of shitty Navy SEALs and hate some of those guys, and absolutely love you, right? Like, just because you're a SEAL, like Andy tells me all the time, just because you're a veteran or you're a SEAL doesn't mean you're like the greatest person in the world, right? And so, but obviously that's a super tight-knit community. There's a barrier to entry. It's a brotherhood, and clearly you're accepted into that brotherhood. And yes, you were in the Navy and a diver, but every one of those guys, like they talk about you like you're like mythical. It's crazy. It's really cool. So anytime a video of yours comes on, I either save it, and honestly, it's hard a lot of times to have the time to absorb all the content that's out there.
Yeah, I'm a little long-winded sometimes,
but yours are the videos that's like, hey, it's coming up on season. I'm wondering about something. You go through and start trying to find it, like that outdoor class. I can't wait for that.
If only you knew somebody that you could just call or text and ask a question.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to be a bother, but no, thank you for coming on and taking all this time, and thanks for coming over this weekend.
No, it was great. I'm
honored to be a friend.
I'm finally glad we got to do this.
Yeah.
But what an amazing weekend. So thankful. Thank you for inviting us. Like, awesome. Like I said, the energy, like just sitting around the fire last night, dude.
Yeah.
That energy was like insane. If you could bottle that, if people who had never experienced that could like feel that, they'd be like, oh, I get it now.
Jim Miller said this weekend, I mean, he was like, he had a couple drinks and he was getting very honest, and he was like pretty emotional about it, but he's like, the world needs to see this, like, and it's the community atmosphere and the working together and the love for each other. And it's like, man, if the world could have more of this,
I agree.
Like things would be a lot better.
I agree.
So, all right, man.
Thanks,
Appreciate
man.
you.
All right.